Chapter 754. Li Yundong suddenly saw that the signature on the title page was Zhang Sanfeng, the founder of the Sanfeng sect of Taoism. He immediately picked up the book in surprise and looked at it carefully. But after reading for a while, Li Yundong found that although the book looked a little old, it was definitely not an antique cultural relic that had been passed down for hundreds of years. It must be a reprint. Perhaps Zhang Sanfeng had mentioned the preface to this secret book. But when Li Yundong flipped to the next page, he saw that the first sentence of the thick black seal script at the beginning of the book was written, "The way of heaven, take away the surpluses and make up for the deficiencies." Then, there was a detailed description of cultivation methods. Before Li Yundong had met Su Chan, his understanding of the way of heaven is to make up for what is lacking had always been based on Jin Yang's 9-yin Sutra. However, after cultivating and reading the ancient books, Li Yundong realized that this sentence came from the 77th chapter of Lao Zi's Tao Te Ching. If the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor was a must-read enlightenment for cultivators, then the Tao Te Ching by Lao Zi, the founder of Taoism, was a must-read high-level internal reference for every cultivator. There was even a saying in the cultivation world that whoever couldn't understand the Tao Te Ching would have no hope for the thunder retribution in his life. The Zhuji phase relied on the strength of one's own furnace and one's own external conditions. The same was true for Shintong and Yang spirit. Similarly, the Jinshan phase could also be achieved with a huge amount of money in addition to chance coincidences. However, after reaching the Jinshan phase, one must truly understand the realm of cultivation and the philosophical ideas in cultivation. It was absolutely impossible not to be smart. Otherwise, cultivators couldn't understand the sentence in Lao Zi's Tao Te Ching, "The Tao begets one, one begets two, two begets three, three begets all things. Man follows the earth follows the heaven follows the Tao, and the Tao follows nature." How could they talk about following the heart and moving heaven and earth with a thought? If they couldn't achieve the unity of heaven and man, how could they talk about the top level of the Jinshan phase? If they didn't cultivate to the top level of the Jinshan phase, how could they survive the thunder retribution? In a few minutes, the heavenly thunder would smash the half-baked Jinshan into pieces. As an experienced person, Li Yundong naturally knew that 1, 2, and 3 seemed simple, but since ancient times, there had been countless cultivators in Chinese history, but there were only a few who had really understood 1, 2, and 3. It could even be said that Celestial Master Zhang of Mount Longhu might not have been able to understand 1, 2, and 3 for every generation. However, there was no doubt that the person who wrote this secret manual had comprehended the 1, 2, 3 within it. This sentence, "The way of heaven, take away surpluses and mend deficiencies," was talking about the way of magical treasures. The power of magic treasures came from the heavens, and the way of the heavens is to take away excess and make up for deficiency. This meant that after a magic treasure was created, if no one used it, it would lose more power than it could replenish itself, and its power would continue to decline. Although Dharma treasures were intelligent, they were inanimate objects after all. They were not like the spirit of all living things, humans, who knew how to cultivate and constantly improve themselves. Therefore, if a magical treasure wanted to become stronger, if it wanted to repair itself after being damaged, it needed the help of others. This was the first sentence in the second chapter that Li Yundong opened. "The way of man is to take away the insufficiency and make up for the excess." When these two meanings were combined, it meant that Dharma treasures did not know how to cultivate themselves, so their Dharma power was constantly losing and declining. However, humans were the spirit of all living things. They knew how to cultivate themselves and store excess essence qi. Therefore, it was to take away the insufficiency and make up for the excess. Why did the strength of cultivators increase? Why did the more Jinshi cultivated, the stronger it became? Why did people grow up? Why did people get fatter the more they ate? The reason was very simple. Laozi, the founder of Taoism in 571 BC, Taishang Laojun of the Nine Heavens Divine Night Realm, had long given the answer: take away the insufficiency and make up for the excess. It was also because of this that cultivators could use their own, the way of man, giving away the excess, to make up for the way of heaven, making up for the deficiency. This was the theoretical basis why Taoist cultivators firmly believed that man could conquer heaven. Although Li Yundong had read many cultivation classics, none of them had explained the way of heaven and the way of man so thoroughly and so brightly. As Li Yundong flipped through the classics, he sighed in his heart, the Penglai sect is indeed worthy of being a powerful sect that was once prosperous. Although I don't know how glorious this sect was at its peak, the classics left behind by the Penglai sect are enough to make the author of this book famous in history. A cultivator who can write such an exquisite cultivation article must be an earth-shattering great cultivator. Li Yundong quickly flipped through the classics, but he didn't find the author's name in it. He couldn't help but sigh and say, in the 5,000 years of Chinese history, how many heroes have been buried in the torrential history? Such a great cultivator didn't leave his mark in the long river of history at all? While he was sighing, Li Yundong couldn't help but see Zhang Sanfeng's preface on the title page. He suddenly thought, could it be that after reading this classic, Zhenren Zhang comprehended the truth of cultivation and founded the Sanfeng sect? While Li Yundong was guessing, he suddenly heard a knock on the door. Li Yundong tilted his ear and knew who was knocking. He immediately laughed and quietly walked to the back of the door to hide. After knocking on the door for a while, the person saw that there was no response, so he carefully poked his head in. As soon as he looked around, Li Yundong, who was hiding behind the door, slapped him on the head. This person was none other than Su Chan. Su Chan let out a cry and quickly grabbed upward with one hand. In an instant, a ball of flame jumped up in the palm of her other hand. This ball of flame quickly stretched into the shape of a sharp blade and stabbed toward Li Yundong. Li Yundong quickly smiled and said, "It's me, it's me." However, Su Chan couldn't hold back. The fire sword was about to pierce Li Yundong's chest. Her face changed dramatically and she suddenly wanted to withdraw her strength. But at this time, Li Yundong stretched out his hand and flicked his finger on Su Chan's aggressive fire sword. With a snap, her fire sword was smashed into pieces. For a moment, it turned into countless sparks and quickly disappeared in the air. Li Yundong saw that the place where the fire sword had passed was scorched black. He couldn't help but smile bitterly and say, "Do you want to kill your husband? Where did you learn magic? It's so powerful." However, Su Chan pouted and said unhappily, "What's so powerful about it? You broke the spell that I had been learning for several days with just one finger." Li Yundong pretended to be angry and slapped the girl's round and perky butt. "Nonsense, isn't it powerful? If it had been me in the past, I'm afraid I would have been lying in bed again. Did you come all the way here just to kill your husband?" Su Chan covered her perky buttocks with both hands and said resentfully, "I've been practicing magic for a few days. I just wanted you to see it." Li Yundong couldn't help but laugh when he saw her childish desire to take credit. "What's the matter? You've been in a bad mood these days, so you've been practicing hard? What magic have you learned? Show it to me." However, Su Chan pouted and tilted her head. "No. I've been practicing hard for a few days, but in your eyes, isn't it still like a child playing? It's boring. I won't show it." Li Yundong saw that the little girl's eyes were full of loss and disappointment. It was obvious that he had run over excitedly to show off his treasures, but he hadn't expected that he would destroy her magic with a flick of his finger and sweep away her prestige. The little girl was naturally very disappointed in her heart. Li Yundong put his arms around the little girl's soft waist with a smile, kissed her on the cheek, and said with a smile, "Silly, I'm about to go through the thunder retribution. My cultivation is several levels higher than yours. How can I compare with you? If I were still in the Yangshan phase, would have been hit just now. So, don't belittle yourself. You look so ugly with a straight face. Be careful that I don't like you." As expected, Su Chan was shocked. She quickly covered her face with both hands and said in horror, "Am I really ugly? Then, don't look at me. I'm going to touch up some makeup." Women put on makeup for the man they liked, and Su Chan was naturally the same. Her nervous look immediately made Li Yundong laugh. He lovingly picked her up and kissed her heavily. Su Chan hadn't expected that Li Yundong would suddenly kiss her. For a moment, her eyes widened and her body was a little stiff. But soon, her body softened, as if she was about to turn into a pool of spring water. She softly melted in Li Yundong's arms. When their lips separated, Su Chan blushed and smiled foolishly. "Why are you kissing me when I'm so ugly?" Li Yundong put on a straight face and pretended to be angry. "Nonsense. Which bastard said that my girl is ugly?" Su Chan giggled and stretched out her jade-like fingers to touch Li Yundong's cheek. "You're so shameless. You're so thick-skinned." Li Yundong chuckled. "I know something even more shameless." As he said this, Li Yundong put on a solemn expression and said seriously, "Benefactor, do you want to reach the Jinshin phase? Do you want to quickly become a great cultivator? Please dial 138x times x times x. If you want to study the Merriment Buddha with me, please dial 1. If you want to study the Merriment Buddha with me, please dial 2. If you want to study the Merriment Buddha with me, please dial 3. If you want to study the Merriment Buddha with me, please dial 4. If you want to study the Merriment Buddha alone, please hang up." For a moment, Su Chan's cheeks turned red. She leaned on Li Yundong's shoulder and laughed so hard that her whole body trembled. However, Li Yundong still said seriously, "This benefactor, this Tanyu, this beautiful girl, hurry up and choose your number. Do you want to choose 1, 2, 3, or 4? Please feel free to choose. I won't force you." These days, Su Chan's mind had been heavy, and she had been depressed. At this time, when she was teased by Li Yundong, she laughed so hard that the unhappiness in her heart seemed to fly beyond the clouds. She blushed, bit her lips gently with her snow-white teeth, and giggled. "Can I choose to hang up the phone?" Li Yundong said in surprise. "What? Haven't you already cultivated this magic skill to the 9th level? You still want to cultivate it? Aren't you afraid of getting calluses?" Su Chan giggled and leaned against Li Yundong's ear, blowing like orchids, but her hand boldly touched Li Yundong's lower body. She looked at him coquettishly and said softly, "Yundong, you are now in the Jinshin phase." With a beauty in his arms, speaking softly and with a faint fragrance, it was really erotic. As soon as Su Chan's hand moved down, Li Yundong immediately became angry. The Vajra pestle was raised high, and the little girl's hand was so scared that she retracted it. But when the little girl's eyes showed a hint of charm that was enough to melt Li Yundong, and when her hand reached down again, Li Yundong grabbed her hand and said softly with a smile, "Little girl, there's still a long time. You'll go out in a while." At this time, the little girl was also moved. Her eyes were like silk, and she asked with blurred eyes, "What? Why should I go out? I don't want to go out. I want to be with you." Li Yundong laughed, hugged the little girl, and kissed her heavily again. Their tongues were entangled, and they were locked in a fierce battle. After a long time, Li Yundong injected his pure Jinqi into the little girl's mouth. When Su Chan received this Jinqi, her whole body suddenly trembled, and her mind slowly became sober. Only then did Li Yundong let go of her. He smiled and told her about Chris, saying, "Accompany her to have a look. Just be her bodyguard this time, okay?" Although Su Chan was reluctant to leave, she also knew that Li Yundong actually wanted her to leave this troublesome place for a while, so she used this excuse. The little girl looked at Li Yundong reluctantly, drawing circles on his chest with her fingers, and said with some resentment, "But how long will it take?" Li Yundong said with a smile, "It will be very soon. It will be a few days at least, 10 days at most. Anyway, I will definitely come back before the spring festival. If you want to spend it outside, I won't allow it." Only then did Su Chan's worry turn into joy. But just as the little girl was about to speak, she suddenly heard Chris's surprised voice coming from outside. "Shiji Ziyuan, what are you doing? What are you thinking about?" Ziyuan's panicked voice came from the door. I I'm fine. Are you okay? Let's go quickly. As she said this, she cleared her throat and pretended to be calm as she said to Li Yundong, we have to go. Li Yunyang took Su Chan's little hand and went out of the door, only to see that Zi Yuan had already hidden at the door. Although her back was facing him, from her snow-white and slender neck, he could still see that this fairy sister's face was blushing all the way to the root of her neck. The pink and decadent color was really frightening. Only then did Li Yundong realize that Zi Yuan had been eavesdropping just now. This fairy sister is not kind. Late at night, I worked hard to finish a chapter. Benefactors, Tanyu, beautiful girls, do you want to understand the happy Buddha? Do you want to choose 1, 2, 3, or 4? Please feel free to choose, I will not force you. Hey, I'm just kidding. Recently, some readers have been asking me about opening a group. Many enthusiastic readers want to provide me with a VIP group, but a group of 200 people is really a little inadequate, so I'd better consider opening a supergroup of 500 people in the future. Now the supergroup is open, 823139993. If you want to join, hurry up. This group will probably be full in a day. However, I will go to sleep in a while, and I guess the group leader will also go to sleep. There are only 2 administrators in the group, so even if the children add in the middle of the night, I'm afraid they won't be able to get in. It's better to wait until tomorrow morning. Chapter 755. After realizing that Zi Yuan might have heard the intimate voices of him and Su Chan just now, Li Yundong's expression suddenly became very strange. He couldn't help but turn his head to look at Su Chan, only to see that the little girl's face was flushed, white and rosy, like a ripe cherry, making people want to take a bite. Li Yundong patted the little girl's head with a smile and said, well, hurry up and pack your luggage. Zi Yuan and Chris are waiting for you. Su Chan responded in a low voice and ran into her room. When she came out again, she was dragging a huge suitcase, 2 big bags in her hands, and a cloth bag on her back. The corner of a pillow was exposed in the cloth bag. Obviously, the little girl had packed all the bedding and other things. Li Yundong was stunned and said in surprise, are you running away from home? Su Chan said blankly, running away from home? No, didn't you ask me to go back with Chris? Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Why did you bring so many things? When we get there, will Chris still be hungry or cold? Come on, just bring a change of clothes. Be good and put everything back. Su Chan turned around sulkily and was about to drag all the things to get them. Chris, who was beside her, also chuckled and said, Su Chan, you can go empty-handed. When you get off the plane, I'll arrange for someone to buy whatever you need. Su Chan suddenly asked tentatively, can I go shopping and buy clothes? Before Chris could speak, Li Yundong glared at her and said, Su Chan, do you really think you're going to play? Don't be shy. Chris smiled and said, no problem. You and Zi Yuan can play in Harrisburg for a while. Although this city is not very big and has a small population, only tens of thousands of people, there is a restaurant called He Family's Chocolate that is very good. I recommend you go and have a look, but I may have to accompany Grandma, so I can't go shopping with you. Of course, I can ask my family to accompany you. Su Chan waved her hand and said with a smile, it's okay. When we get off the plane, I'll ask Sister Zi Yuan to see what's wrong with your grandma first. After Sister Zi Yuan has cured your grandma, we'll go shopping, okay? As she said this, she rushed over to Zi Yuan, held her arm, and said with a smile, Sister Zi Yuan, what do you think? Zi Yuan had originally wanted to say goodbye to Li Yundong, but she hadn't expected to accidentally hear the intimate private conversation between Li Yundong and Su Chan at the door. For a moment, she was a little stunned, but crazy had accidentally exposed her. She was embarrassed, and her cheeks blushed for a long time. At this time, it was difficult to calm down, but Su Chan jumped over again. Zi Yuan glanced at Su Chan helplessly. She secretly admired that this girl had a big heart that couldn't bear to be sad. Even when she encountered a big event like the Penglai murder case, she was only sad for a few days and then she recovered as before. Su Chan's smiling face didn't look the least bit gloomy. It had to be said that she was heartless and open-minded, but it was indeed a skill to be able to be so open-minded and cheerful. Zi Yuan looked at Su Chan helplessly and said, I may not be able to cure Crazy's grandma. I still don't know what's going on with her. Su Chan waved her hand carelessly and said, It's okay. Except for Yundong, you are the best. There's nothing that can stump you. As long as you take action, this kind of small thing will definitely be easy. Zi Yuan smiled helplessly and said to Crazy, Don't get your hopes up. I'm not as good as she says. Chris knew that her grandmother was living in the best hospital in Harrisburg and receiving the best treatment. Although she admired the magical powers possessed by Li Yundong, Zi Yuan, and the others, if Western medicine could not solve the problem of snatching a patient with severe cerebral thrombosis back from the arms of death, she was afraid that these Easterners might not be able to solve the problem either. Because of this, Crazy didn't take Su Chan's words to heart, but she still nodded politely and smiled gratefully. It's good that you have this intention. I appreciate it very much. Li Yundong, who was standing to one side, smiled and said, Well, don't be so polite. Let's talk about it on the way. Zi Yuan smiled and said, Then we'll go first. Su Chan also waved at Li Yundong and said, Yundong, if Sister Zi Yuan can't cure it, you can come over and help. Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry. If Zi Yuan couldn't cure it, would he be able to? But he couldn't say this. He smiled and pinched the little girl's cheek, then winked at her and said, Don't make trouble for Zi Yuan outside. Su Chan slapped Li Yundong's hand away and said angrily, You're so annoying. I'm not a child anymore. Li Yundong smiled and nodded to Zi Yuan and Crazy, then saw them out of the door. After watching the three of them leave the community, Li Yundong turned around and returned to his room, carefully studying the secret method of patching heaven. Unknowingly, he had been studying it for 3 or 4 hours. When there was a knock on the door, Li Yundong came to his senses and said loudly, Come in, the door is open. As soon as the door was pushed open, Zhou Qin stood at the door and asked curiously, Master, why is there no one at home? I went to the other side and saw that Zi Yuan was not there either. Li Yundong put down his hand and asked, Where's Ruan Hongling? Zhou Qin pursed her lips and smiled. Hongling is helping in the tea house. The shop is too busy to take care of her. Only you are here leisurely. What are you doing? Li Yundong waved at her and motioned for her to come in. He said with a smile, Crazy's grandmother is seriously ill and is in a hurry to go back. I asked Zi Yuan and Su Chan to go back with her. Zhou Qin suddenly smiled, but her eyes fell on the book in Li Yundong's hand. She looked at it for a while and asked curiously, Is this the secret method of patching heaven that you brought back from the Penglai sect? After Li Yundong had returned home, although he had hidden the matter of the Penglai sect from the whole Fox Zen school, he had been blunt with Zhou Qin, so she had recognized the secret record at a glance. Li Yundong nodded. He handed the secret method of patching heaven in his hand to Zhou Qin and said, I originally wanted to copy this book, but my handwriting is too ugly, so I didn't. You can copy it. Zhou Qin hurriedly waved her hand. No, if we copy it and someone finds out, won't it be a false accusation? Li Yundong couldn't help laughing. Haven't you always been very bold? Zhou Qin stared at Li Yundong with a complicated look in her eyes and suddenly whispered, Master, I'm not afraid, but you can't have your reputation tarnished. Li Yundong stared at the beautiful lady in front of him and suddenly said with a smile, Don't be silly. I asked you to make a copy not because I want to covet the magic recorded in this cultivation manual. I just don't want such a peerless magic to disappear from the world. If people scold me after this, let them scold me. Anyway, I don't think I'll be able to listen to it. Only then did Zhou Qin understand. She looked at Li Yundong with admiration and said, Master, you're right. I'll make a copy now. As long as you have a clear conscience, it doesn't matter what others say, right? Li Yundong nodded with a smile and said, that's the truth. Go ahead. Zhou Qin took the secret method of heaven patching and turned to go out. Li Yundong looked at her slim figure and smiled slightly. He turned his face and continued to ponder about Yu Tian. But not long after Li Yundong thought about it, Zhou Qin came in with a stack of paper and said with a smile, I've done it. Li Yundong was startled. What? So fast? Are you a clerk? Even a clerk isn't as fast as you, right? It's only been less than 15 minutes, hasn't it? Zhou Qin covered her mouth and giggled. Master, you've cultivated so hard that your brain has become stupid. Don't you know that there is a machine called a photocopier? Li Yundong's eyes widened. A photocopier? Where can we get a photocopier? Zhou Qin looked at Li Yundong helplessly. Master, there is a photocopier downstairs. Li Yundong also looked at Zhou Qin helplessly. Zhou Qin, Miss Zhou, you can't be lazy like this, can you? If someone sees you copying the secret method of heaven patching, what will they think? Isn't it like yellow mud falling into your pants? Even if it's not sh*t, it's still sh*t. Zhou Qin smiled and waved her hand. Don't worry, I've specially looked around. Besides, the copy is 100% correct. If I make a mistake in copying a word, wouldn't it be a huge mistake? Li Yundong smiled and said, you can find an excuse to be lazy. Okay, I'm convinced. Give me the original copy. By the way, you can take a look at the copy. Although this book is about how to repair powerful magical weapons, the description of cultivation methods in it is still very beneficial to people. You can study it carefully. Zhou Qin had always been by Li Yundong's side without any complaints or requests. She had used all her yearning and secret love for Li Yundong on the way of cultivation. It could be said that she was a cultivation maniac. As long as she had time, she would seize the time to practice. However, she had been too busy in the tea house recently, and she had been busy dealing with some worldly affairs, so her cultivation had been slightly delayed. But at this time, when she heard that there was such a precious and rare cultivation method, Zhou Qin was so excited that her eyes lit up. She held the code as if she had found a treasure and rushed back. But not long after, Zhou Qin rushed back and said carefully to Li Yundong, Master, someone wants to see you. Li Yundong asked curiously, who wants to see me? Zhou Qin's cheeks turned red, which was rare for her. She stammered, yes. My father wants to see you. Li Yundong became more and more confused. Zhou Kacheng wants to see me? Zhou Qin shook her head in embarrassment and said, if you don't want to see him, then I'll refuse for you. Li Yundong looked at Zhou Qin, only to see that although her eyes were evasive, there was a faint hope in them, as if she was eager for him to agree. Although Li Yundong didn't like to deal with bureaucrats, this person was different. He was Zhou Qin's father. If he didn't agree, Zhou Qin would be very embarrassed, wouldn't she? Li Yundong thought for a moment and said with a smile, no need. When and where? Zhou Qin's face lit up with joy. Today, just downstairs. Li Yundong took a deep breath. Good heavens, you act first and report later. Chapter 756. Just as Zhou Kacheng silently found Li Yundong's house, Wan Zhenyuan took Yu Tian to the Seven-Li Mountain Pond in Dongwu City. Yu Tian was a language teacher, so his foundation was naturally very good. He could be considered half a human. At this moment, even though he had a blood feud, when he saw the picturesque scenery of the Seven-Li Pond, he couldn't help but sigh deeply. Dong Yuwu's reputation is indeed well-deserved. Yu Tian looked at the bluestone road of the Seven-Li Mountain Pond and sighed with emotion. Although he had never been to Dongwu City, he knew the reputation of the Seven-Li Mountain Pond. In 85 AD, which was the second year of the Baoli dynasty in the Tang dynasty, the great poet Bai Ji was transferred from Hangzhou to the provincial governor of the Dongwu kingdom. In order to facilitate the water transportation of the Dongwu Kingdom, he dug a mountain pond river from Tiger Hill in the west to Changmen in the east. He built a road north of the Mountain Pond River and called it Mountain Pond Street. The Mountain Pond River and Mountain Pond Street were about 7 miles long, so this place was called the Sevenly Mountain Pond. The information and deeds about the Sevenly Mountain Pond flashed through Yu Youtian's mind like a carousel lantern. He usually boasted that he was an elegant person, but now he was not in the mood to appreciate such a beautiful scenery of the Dongwu Kingdom at all. He saw many family reuniting and laughing as they took pictures together at various scenic spots. For a moment, he couldn't help but think of the dead Yu Qing and Yu Manlu. His heart ached, and as he recalled the scene, tears streamed down his face. Seeing that he was sad, Wang Jinyuan deliberately changed the topic to distract him. He said with a smile, "Jinren, you are a native of Shandong. This is the first time you have come to the beautiful land of Jiangnan. You feel different from the north, don't you?" Yu Yutian turned around and wiped his tears. The corners of his mouth twitched as he said with a smile, "The scenery of Penglai is magnificent and majestic, but it is full of vicissitudes of life. It is spectacular, but not delicate. The scenic spots of the Dongwu Kingdom are beautiful and small, but they are full of beauty and tactfulness. They are full of beauty, but not spectacular." Wang Jinyuan clapped his hands and said with a smile, "Well said. You deserve to be a language teacher. I can't say such things casually." Yu Yutian smiled sadly and said in an incomparably low voice, "As the saying goes, a scholar is a useless scholar." Only now did I fully comprehend this sentence. When Yu Qing married me in the past, I always wondered why someone as outstanding as her would take a fancy to a scholar like me who couldn't carry a heavy load. Later on, Qing told me that she liked my ability to speak eloquently, and she liked the way I wrote. But now I know, what's the use of that? In the past, I always looked down on my wife's path of cultivation. I thought that everything was inferior, and only studying was good. I just wanted to cater to her and have more in common with her. That's why I decided to cultivate this Tao out of curiosity. With that, Yu Yutian raised his head and let out a long sigh. He said sorrowfully, "When Qing, Xiao Lu, and I were separated forever, I realized that the path of cultivation was the true path of the world." As he spoke, Yu Yutian couldn't help but cry again. He wiped his tears and looked at Wang Jinyuan. "Master Wan, where is this chivalrous master you were talking about? As long as he can help me take revenge, I am willing to do anything for him." Wang Jinyuan waved his hand and said, "Hey, Jinren, what are you talking about? I promise you that as long as you ask, this person will definitely stand up for you." Yu Yutian couldn't help but tremble with excitement. "Where is this person? Take me there quickly." Wang Jinyuan smiled and said, "Don't worry, we'll be there soon." As he spoke, he pointed to an inconspicuous old house in the depths of Sevenly Mountain Pond. At a glance, Yu Yutian saw the old house with cornices, white walls, black tiles, and a pair of stone lions at the door. For a moment, he was stunned. This great master lives in such a place? Wang Jinyuan smiled and said, "A great hermit hides in the court, and a hidden hermit in the city." Yu Yutian nodded in understanding and nervously followed Wang Jinyuan into the old house. As soon as he entered, he saw a rather beautiful woman sitting on a stone bench in the front hall. One of her arms was lazily propped up on the stone table, and she was watching a man in his 30s write stroke by stroke in boredom. Wang Jinyuan nodded to the nervous Yu Yutian, then cupped his hands and said with a smile, "Jinren Lu is really in a good mood." Lu Yi snorted. "Jinren Lu? When did you call me that?" As he spoke, Lu Yi raised his head and glanced at him. It would have been better if he didn't look, but when he did, he was so scared that he shivered. Why was Yu Yutian here? Why did Wang Jinyuan bring him back? This bastard, is he trying to frame me? Lu Yi had never expected that Wang Jinyuan would actually bring Yu Yutian to him. At this moment, even though Lu Yi was a wily old fox with a profound cultivation base and great mental fortitude, He was still frightened by Yu Tian to the point that he almost revealed a ferocious expression. He unconsciously wanted to smash this person into minced meat with his palm. However, as soon as Lu Yi moved his hand, Wang Jinyuan quietly stood in front of Yu Tian, blocking his line of sight. Wang Jinyuan cupped his hands to Lu Yi with a smile on his face and said, "Jinren Lu, you don't have to be so excited to see an old friend, right? You don't know Jinren Yu, do you? Come, let me introduce you." A flash of anger and shock quickly passed through Lu Ye's eyes. He suppressed the anger and shock in his heart and said in a deep voice, "Well, I was wondering why there was a magpie flying to the branch today. It turns out that a noble has come today." Mei Nyang, who was standing to the side, did not notice the strange situation in front of her at all. She asked curiously, "Where did the magpie come from?" Lu Yi immediately lowered his head and glared at her with an extremely sharp gaze. His voice was very low as he said, "Go in first and make some tea." Mei Nyang was so frightened by Lu Ye's gaze that she felt as if her heart had been stabbed by a knife. She covered her chest and got up to run into the room. Lu Yi used the action of lowering his head to temporarily vent the anger in his heart. When he raised his head again, his face was full of a gentle smile. "Master Wan, can you introduce me to your distinguished guest?" Before Wang Jinyuan had time to speak, Yu Tian knelt on the ground with a plop and couldn't help crying out loud, "Jinren Lu, Master Wan said that you are chivalrous and have a profound cultivation. You are the current Meng Changjun, the modern bearded man. Please uphold justice for me and avenge me." After that, he kowtowed heavily with his head. He kowtowed like he was pounding garlic, and even the hard bluestone ground was shattered. Lu Yi was a smart person. After hearing these words, he realized the cause of this matter. He quickly glanced at Wang Jinyuan, who was smiling strangely, and took 2 steps forward. He helped him up with a warm expression and said, "Jinren Yu, get up quickly. If you have any difficulties, just tell me. If I can help, I will definitely help." Wang Jinyuan also patted the crying Yu Tian and helped him up. After receiving Lu Ye's verbal permission, Yu Tian was relieved. He got up from the ground and carefully sat down next to the stone table. He began to tell the whole story in a low voice. Lu Yi seemed to be listening carefully, but his mind had long flown away. Although Yu Tian had explained it in detail, was there anyone in the world who knew the matter better than him? He had killed them with his own hands, and the whole situation had been set up by him. After listening to Yu Tian's tearful complaint, Lu Yi sighed and said, "Don't worry, Jinren Yu. I will definitely seek justice for you. However, it's time to go through the Thunder Retribution. Do you think we can wait until the Thunder Retribution is over before we go to avenge you?" Yu Tian was overjoyed and said, "Jinren Yu, since you are willing to help me, what else can I ask for? Not to mention waiting for more than 10 days, even if I have to wait for more than 10 years, I am willing." Lu Yi chuckled. At this time, Mei Nyang walked out with 3 cups of tea. Lu Yi pointed at Yu Tian and said to her, "Mei Nyang, take him in to rest for a while." Mei Nyang looked at Lu Yi strangely, smiled at Yu Tian, and said, "Please follow me." Yu Tian didn't dare to look at her too much. He was afraid that he would make Lu Yi unhappy and go back on his word. He followed Mei Nyang into this dragon's den and tiger's den. After Yu Tian left, Lu Ye's face slowly darkened. He narrowed his eyes and looked at Wang Jinyuan. "Master Wan, you really gave me a big surprise." Wang Jinyuan raised his head and laughed. "Jinren Lu, you must be joking. How is this a surprise? The real surprise is yet to come. Aren't you going to deal with Li Yundong? I've given you such a good opportunity. Aren't you going to thank me?" "Thank you?" Lu Yi couldn't help but laugh angrily. "It seems that I really should thank you properly. Tell me, how can I thank you?" Wang Jinyuan waved his hand with a smile on his face. It seemed that he didn't notice the anger and ridicule in Lu Ye's tone at all. He said with a smile, "Jinren Lu, as long as you don't blame me for being nosy." Could it be that you're not worried about the only witness running around outside and causing trouble when the time comes? What could be more reassuring than putting such an important person under your nose? Lu Yi sneered. In his opinion, Wang Jinyuan's action could be said to be killing many birds with one stone. It was both a demonstration of force and a threat to him. Lu Yi thought to himself, this guy, does he think that he can take advantage of me just because he has reached the Jinshin phase? Lu Yi sneered and said, I thought I was cold-blooded and cruel enough. I didn't expect that compared with you, Master Wan, my cultivation is still far inferior. I really admire your ability to teach others to recognize a thief as their father. You must teach me well some other day. How about it? Wang Jinyuan cupped his hands and said with a smile, Jinren Lu, you flatter me. How could I dare to compare myself with you? You can destroy a sect with a flip of your palm. That is an amazing ability. Wang Jinyuan had always been ambitious and was also an ambitious person. Naturally, he was unwilling to be under others for a long time. At this time, he had just broken through to the Jinshin phase, so he could no longer bear Lu Ye's orders. However, he didn't dare to confront him openly, so he had an idea and used Yu Tian to test Lu Yi. As long as Lu Yi could tolerate it, it meant that he had tested Lu Ye's new bottom line. If he could tolerate such a thing today, he must be able to tolerate more tomorrow. Seeing that Lu Yi had not done anything, Wang Jinyuan became more confident and proud, and his smile became brighter. Lu Yi looked at his smile and also smiled. The two old foxes looked at each other and laughed, but their eyes were extremely cold. They couldn't wait to kick each other in the face. Humph, sooner or later, I will kill you with my own hands. Lu Yi and Wang Jinyuan stared at each other, and the same thought flashed through their minds. Chapter 757. When Yu Tian walked into the trap and danced with the wolf, in Tiannan City, Zhou Kachang was coming out of Li Yunyang's home gloomily. Beside him was his precious daughter, Zhou Qin. It was rare for Zhou Qin not to bicker with her father. She silently accompanied her father downstairs and sent him all the way. This stubborn young lady had a taut face and her mouth was tightly pursed, as if she would laugh if she relaxed a little. Zhou Qin accompanied her father all the way downstairs. After watching him get into the car and leave, she couldn't help but burst into laughter. But as soon as she laughed, Zhou Kachang's car drove back. He tilted his head from the car, poked out half of his face, and said unhappily, girls are really outgoing. You speak up for him and even join him to make things difficult for your father. You even make fun of me behind my back. That's outrageous. Zhou Qin immediately straightened her face and said seriously, as the saying goes, a teacher for a day is a father for a lifetime. What's wrong with me siding with my master? Zhou Kachang glared at her and said, anyway, keep an eye on your master. Don't let him make trouble again. Why don't you take a look at Desengxian? What are they doing with so many people from Yamaguchi-gumi? If it weren't for me, they and your master would have been arrested long ago. Zhou Qin snorted and said, don't take me for a fool. I've talked to these Japanese people. They are all relatively clean. Who would come to China for you to catch? Zhou Kachang said angrily, anyway, tell him to stop. I just warned you before, and you made such a big trouble. If it weren't for the fact that he is so famous now, the higher-ups would have done something to him long ago. Zhou Qin snorted and said, well, don't talk nonsense. Aren't you here? Zhou Kachang was so angry that his nose was crooked. I'm a high-ranking official anyway. Do you think I have to do this kind of work for you? It was rare for Zhou Qin not to bicker with her father. She just waved her hand at him and said, well, no matter how high your official position is, you are still a servant of the people. If you don't do this kind of thing, what else can you do? If you don't help us, are you going to help the Japanese? Zhou Kachang was so angry that he laughed. He pointed at Zhou Qin and said, well, you're good. Good, good, good. He patted the driver's seat in front of him and shouted, let's go. But after that, before he left, he turned around and smiled at Zhou Qin. By the way, tell that guy that I'm very happy that he taught the Japanese a lesson, haha. After that, he raised the glass and quickly disappeared from Zhou Qin's sight. Zhou Qin turned around. When she went upstairs, there was still a playful smile on the corner of her mouth, as if she was recalling the conversation between her father and Li Yundong. His father had come this time to tell Li Yundong to keep a low profile. What had Li Yundong said at that time? At that time, Li Yundong said helplessly, I also want to keep a low profile, but people always come to me to fight. What can I do? We can't just let them hit us on the left side of our faces and let them hit us on the right side, right? His father was obviously angered by Li Yundong's somewhat shameless words. He chased after him and said, Li Yundong, as the saying goes, a big hermit hides in the court, a medium hermit hides in the city, and a small hermit hides in the wild. I don't think you're someone who's willing to be alone, so I don't think you're going to hide in the wilderness. But now that you're hiding in the city and causing such a ruckus, let me ask you, do you have any plans to enter the political world? Hearing this, Zhou Qin knew that her heart was beating faster at that time. Only she knew what her father meant by his words. He wanted to put a curse on Li Yundong, but at the same time, he wanted to cultivate him so that in the future, he would owe her a favor and marry her. Zhou Qin grew up in a family of officials. For such a trick, she could clearly figure out the other party's intentions with a little thought. At this time, Zhou Qin walked to the door of the house and stood in front of the door, holding the door handle in one hand and the key in the other. Her eyes were distant, as if she was thinking about the scene just now. If he had agreed at that time, what would have happened? Zhou Qin couldn't help but let her imagination run wild for a moment. She bit her teeth and looked like a little girl with hidden bitterness. But Zhou Qin also knew that Li Yundong would not have agreed. Although he was easygoing and approachable, Zhou Qin knew very well that there was something extremely arrogant in this boy's bones. No one, no force, and no force in the world could tame him. He was definitely not a cultivator raised under that kind of system. In fact, Li Yundong refused without any surprise, but his refusal was very clever. It did not hurt Zhou Kachang's face at all, and it also gave Zhou Qin a good way out. A big hermit hides in the court? Li Yundong suddenly laughed at that time. A talent like me is not suitable to hide in the court. In fact, I am suitable to hide in. Zhou Kachang's face changed at that time. Do you still want to hide in the wild? Zhou Qin was a very smart woman, so she naturally knew what Zhou Kachang's subtext was at that time. He had originally wanted to say, do you still want to take my daughter to hide in the wild and take her to suffer like this? But Zhou Kachang knew that if he said this, his daughter would immediately fall out with him. In fact, at that time, Zhou Qin's face had indeed become very nervous. Like a firebird with its feathers erect, she stared at her father with a warning look in her eyes. Zhou Qin stood at the door in a daze, recalling the scene at that time. She unlocked the door, pushed it open, and walked in. After entering the door, she leaned her back against the door and breathed a sigh of relief. Her eyes looked at the ceiling faintly, and the situation at that time unconsciously appeared in her mind. Fortunately, Father didn't say this at that time. Otherwise, I really don't know how to behave in front of Master. He made it sound like he was threatening him. Zhou Qin thought to herself, but the corners of her mouth unconsciously showed a smile. She smiled and thought to herself, I didn't expect Master to still speak the same way as before, even though he has reached such a high cultivation realm. It's really funny. What did Li Yundong say at that time? Yes, at that time, Li Yundong looked at his father for a long time, and then suddenly smiled helplessly and said, Governor Zhou, you think too highly of me. Hide in the wild? That's not suitable for me. I was born in the city, and you want me to settle down in the mountains. Don't you want my life? How about I hide in bed? What do you think? Hide in bed? What the hell is this? Thinking of this, Zhou Qin couldn't help but burst into laughter again. Her father's expression at that time was really wonderful. His mouth could almost be stuffed with his fist. He definitely couldn't believe that the boy in front of him dared to joke like this. Fortunately, he hadn't said something like, "Take my daughter to hide in the wild," just now. Otherwise, if it became, "Take my daughter to hide in bed," he would really jump off a building and be too ashamed to see anyone. Just as Zhou Qin was leaning against the door and laughing, Li Yundong raised his voice in the room and said, "Hey, is your father gone? Please, don't laugh. Is it that funny?" Zhou Qin suddenly came to her senses and walked to Li Yundong's door with a playful smile on her face. She said softly with a smile, "Who told you to say such a thing? What kind of person are you now? How can you say such a thing?" Li Yundong spread out his hands and pointed to his bed. "Originally, they were afraid that I would go out and cause trouble, so I simply cultivated in bed all day long." That was indeed a little secluded in bed. Zhou Qin rolled her eyes and suddenly asked, "You mean hiding in bed with Su Chan, right?" Li Yundong suddenly coughed dryly and said seriously with a straight face, "Why do you sound so strange? Dual cultivation is a very serious matter in cultivation. Hiding in bed with one's Taoist partner is also a joy in the world." Taoist companion? Zhou Qin lowered her head and repeated this sentence to herself several times in a low voice. Suddenly, she raised her head and asked boldly, "Master, am I also your Taoist companion?" This sentence was too ambiguous. Even Zhou Qin didn't know why she suddenly asked such a question. Perhaps it was because the feelings that had been suppressed for too long had suddenly taken root in the heavy and closed rock. Perhaps it was because there was no one in the room at this time, which gave Zhou Qin a trace of courage. Perhaps this was just human nature, the inevitable result of a girl's deep love for another man. But no matter what, as soon as Zhou Qin said this, she regretted it. The proud young lady lowered her noble and elegant swan-like neck. Shyness and chagrin filled her cheeks and neck like the sunset. Out of the unique reserve and self-esteem of a young girl, Zhou Qin wanted to escape from this place immediately, but she seemed to be possessed. Her feet seemed to be rooted to the ground, and she didn't move at all. She had been paying attention to the man in front of her out of the corner of her eye, and her heart was beating wildly. Li Yundong was also stunned by Zhou Qin's question. He couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. Many scenes flashed through his mind in an instant. Once, when he was still a young boy and she was still a noble young lady, she had asked him out for the first time in the school pavilion and boldly confessed her love for him. Once, when he had angrily attacked He Xiao and was forced to separate from Su Chan, she had gone to Tibet to cultivate hard. For him, she would rather jump off a building and beg for death than implicate him. Once, she had stubbornly and coldly refused him in the hospital, but in the end, she had been amused by him and smiled through her tears, revealing a lovely and pretty look of a little girl. Scenes flashed through Li Yundong's mind like a lantern. He couldn't help but ask himself at a loss, "Yes, who is Zhou Qin to me? Is she just a disciple? How can I not understand her feelings for me? If she is like this, what about Ziyuan?" Li Yundong's confusion for a moment made Zhou Qin's heart tighten. She felt as if there was an invisible hand in front of her tightly squeezing her heart, forcing her to breathe. "Zhou Qin, you be **starred, how could you ask such a stupid question?" Zhou Qin, who had come to her senses, secretly scolded herself in a low voice. She quickly raised her head and pretended that nothing had happened. She giggled and said, "Master, I'm just teasing you. Look at how nervous you are." Li Yundong looked at Zhou Qin with a complicated look in his eyes. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but Zhou Qin waved her hand and said with an extremely bright smile, "It's okay. I'll go back to my room to read the secret method of patching heaven first. Master, you can do your own things. I won't disturb you." After that, she quickly turned around and closed herself in her room, leaving only a young and beautiful but lonely figure for Li Yundong. Li Yundong stood there for a long time and couldn't help but sigh sadly. The world of mortals is full of troubles. When will the world end? I want to go to the 9 realms, but I worry that I have few friends. After Li Yundong casually made up a limerick, he soon smiled self-deprecatingly and said to himself, "Damn it, Socrates said that if you marry a gentle and beautiful woman, you will be very happy. If you marry a shrew, you will become a philosopher. If I see Socrates, I will tell him that if you can have 3 beautiful women by your side at the same time, and you are unwilling to give up any of them, then you will become a poet." Chapter 758. Men were always greedy animals. Even a man like Li Yundong, who was loyal to Su Chan, couldn't help but be in a dilemma when faced with the feelings of Zi Yuan and Zhou Qin. He didn't want to hurt these 2 girls who had sacrificed almost everything for him, so he had always avoided facing this problem like an ostrich. But Li Yundong also knew that he would have to face this problem sooner or later and solve it. But Li Yundong also knew that, at least not now. While Li Yundong was alone in a dilemma, Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Chris were rushing to the United States. In Tiannan University, Yan Hua, the president of the student union. No, it should be said that Yan Fang, she was in even more pain now. In the office of the student union in the office building, many seniors gathered together excitedly, talking about Li Yundong, who had once been an influential figure in the school. But this time, there were 2 more people among the people they were talking about, the former president of the student union, Feng Na, and her best friend, Ching Cheng. It was about to be winter vacation, and the leaders of the student union had nothing to do. Most of them were juniors or seniors. Others were busy reviewing their lessons and preparing for the exam, but they were all old foxes. They didn't care about the exam at all. When they had time, they would gather together to spread gossip. Among the many gossips, the gossip about Li Yundong and the others was the most popular. Although Li Yundong had disappeared from their sight, this did not diminish the curiosity of the students in the school. Instead, it made them even more mysterious and admiring. "Hey, guess how much Feng Na and Ching Cheng's monthly salary is now?" "I don't know. I just went to Li Yundong's new tea house 2 days ago. The business is really good. I really can't figure it out. A cup of tea at Desanxian is so expensive that it's almost equivalent to my monthly living expenses, but there are still so many people drinking it. It's unbelievable. No matter how I look at it, the daily turnover of this tea house is at least 6 figures. Tisk, 6 figures? You underestimate Desanxian too much. I heard that a group of Japanese people came out of nowhere and drank all the tea in the tea house a few days ago. It is said that they are still worshipping and burning incense in the tea house. Strange, the Japanese came to the tea house of China to worship and burn incense? Did you take the wrong medicine? Maybe Li Yundong is unconventional? Alas, to be honest, when I went to the opening of the Desanxian tea house with Feng Na and Ching Cheng, I was shocked by so many senior officials. At that time, I felt that Li Yundong was very powerful, but I didn't expect him to be so powerful. He was so influential that the Japanese came to China to support him. This is too exaggerated. Otherwise, why would we say that he is the pride of Tiannan University? Oh. Am I right? As the student spoke, he kept winking at Yan Fang, who was not far away, as if he wanted to say something to her. Almost everyone in Tiannan University knew that Li Yundong had a grudge with Yan Hua. Li Yundong had helped Feng Na take part in the student council election and eventually defeated Yan Hua to win the championship. This was something that everyone was familiar with. At that time, everyone present thought that if it weren't for Li Yundong, Feng Na wouldn't have been able to beat Yan Hua no matter how many mouths she had. Moreover, when Li Yundong had just opened Desanxian, Yan Hua had once inadvertently said in front of them that Desanxian's business would be bleak and that it would close down in the future. But now it seemed that Yan Hua had really slapped himself in the mouth. Yan Fang naturally knew that these students were saying this to her. She couldn't help but feel more and more irritated. The happiest thing in the world was to hear that one's enemy was living a miserable life. Similarly, the most depressing thing in the world was to hear that one's enemy was doing well, while one's own life was in dire straits. But what made her even more irritated was not the noise of these students. After all, she was a senior cultivator and had once been a master at the top phase of the Yang spirit realm. She was only one step away from the Jinshin. Moreover, in order to take revenge, she had lurked in the Fox Zen school for 9 years. If she had been angry with these students, she would not have been able to live until now. What really made Yan Fong depressed and irritated was that although she had occupied her nephew's body, in her opinion, with her cultivation knowledge and talent, as well as her experience, she would definitely make rapid progress in her cultivation if she occupied such a good man's 7 treasures body furnace. Even if she couldn't break through the Jinshin phase, she would definitely be able to quickly return to the top phase of the Yang spirit realm. Only after losing it would people know how to cherish it. Although the top phase of the Yang spirit realm was not a very great realm in today's cultivation world, Yan Fong herself was not even at the top phase of the Yang spirit realm, which made her suffer every day. She wished she could immediately regain her previous strength. However, when it comes to cultivation, haste makes waste. The more anxious Yan Fong was, the less effective her cultivation would be. On the contrary, her cultivation would continue to decline. What made Yan Fong feel the most pain was that her original primordial yin qi and primordial yang qi in Yan Hua's body were constantly fighting every day, as if 2 incompatible forces were fighting in her body every day. Most importantly, every time the yin and yang qi in her body fought, she began to have evil thoughts, thinking about those shameful things between men and women. Almost all of her daily cultivation was wasted on controlling these evil thoughts and preventing herself from being possessed by the devil, the internal friction and internal strife. Yan Fong knew that if this went on, it would be very difficult for her to keep her yin spirit body, let alone restore her cultivation quotient. However, she had no solution to the problem in front of her. How could she not be irritated? At this time, these little kids were ridiculing her. Yan Fong became more and more angry. She turned her face and glared at them fiercely. These college students were just trying to have fun with their mouths. How could they compete with a cultivator like Yan Fong? As soon as she glanced at them, everyone felt their hearts skip a beat, as if they had been burned by an iron brand. They couldn't help but immediately withdraw their gazes and change the topic for a while. After staying in the room for a while, Yan Fong felt that it was so boring that she couldn't stay any longer, so she rushed out anxiously. But when she came outside and was in this quiet and peaceful campus, Yan Fong still couldn't calm her restless and angry heart. Because she had followed Chris and the others to Tiandu Peak, Hardadef had been framed by her. Although Yan Fong had used her yin spirit to look for Hardadef's body, she couldn't find it no matter how hard she tried. In her anger, she had to make a backup plan. Hardadef was not dead, and her identity would be leaked. In panic, the suspicious Yan Fong couldn't trust anyone. She cut off all contact with the cultivation world and waited for the news uneasily. But to her surprise, everything was calm, and there seemed to be nothing unusual around her. Apart from the news that the Desanxian teahouse's business was booming from these so-called classmates, she didn't even know what had happened in the cultivation world. Maybe it's time to go to Desanxian to test it out. Yan Fong took a deep breath and forcibly suppressed the rolling yuanyang qi in her chest. Such a thought came to her mind. But she quickly rejected it, because she knew that if she probed the other party's background with her current cultivation, if she was discovered by the other party, she would be courting death and walking into a trap. At the very least, she had to restore her yang spirit body, so that even if she couldn't beat them, she could still escape. Thinking of this, Yan Fong couldn't help feeling irritated again. When will I be able to cultivate the yang spirit body again? I'm afraid it's hopeless in this lifetime, isn't it? Thinking of this, Yan Fong couldn't help but feel a little desperate. She walked around the campus in a daze. After an unknown period of time, she found that she had unknowingly walked back to her home. She subconsciously opened the door, and when she walked into the house, she saw Yan Hua's mother in the living room, watching the smiling, proud wanderer. It was the part where Ren Wuxing and Ling Hu Chong talked about how he passed the sunflower manual to Dongfang Bubi. When Yan Hua's mother saw Yan Hua coming back, she stood up and said with a smile, "Little Hua, you're back? do you want me to make you something to eat? But Yan Hua didn't even look at her. He turned around and went into his room. Yan Hua's mother seemed to have gotten used to Yan Hua's attitude. She sighed softly, as if she was afraid of disturbing her child, and turned down the TV volume a lot. But although she had turned down the volume, one of the classic lines still got into Yan Fang's ears. This sentence suddenly made Yan Fang's whole body tremble, and her whole person was stunned. This sentence was like the ringing of a big bell, and it was deafening, buzzing in her mind. This sentence was, if you want to practice divine skills, castrate yourself with a knife. Some of the descriptions about martial arts and cultivation in Jin Yang's wuxia novels were fabricated, which did not match the actual history. For example, the peak of Chinese martial arts was in the late Qing dynasty and the early Republic of China, not the more ancient the more powerful, mentioned in his book. The world's martial arts did not come from the Shaolin Temple. In addition, Yin Jiping was not a villain who had defiled Shaolongnu. In real history, Yin Jiping was a great cultivator with extremely high cultivation among the leaders of the Chuanjin sect. But among the many deviations, the seemingly absurd sentence, if you want to practice divine skills, castrate yourself with a knife, was an extremely classic maxim in the cultivation world. In the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, Emperor Lu Jixing of the Southern Han dynasty issued the most absurd decree in the 5,000 years of Chinese history: anyone who wanted to be an official had to be castrated. Even monks and Taoists who wanted to sit and discuss the Tao with him had to be castrated. Although the Southern Han dynasty was peaceful in Guangdong, Guangxi, and a part of Vietnam, it could also be considered one of the longer dynasties among the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. Unfortunately, the people of this dynasty encountered a great pervert like Lu Jixing. For a time, the entire Southern Han dynasty almost became a castrated country. In order to become an official, many people had no choice but to castrate themselves with a knife. And some Taoist and Buddhist cultivators, who wanted to preach the Tao, had no choice but to clench their teeth and castrate themselves. But when they castrated themselves, they found that they no longer had the worries of the secular world. It seemed that they had suddenly become pure and desireless, with no desires and no desires. Speaking of which, this was also nonsense. Their balls had been castrated, so what else could they pursue? But the most difficult part of cultivation was to control one's heart. As the saying goes, the old don't practice martial arts, the young don't cultivate the Tao. The muscles and bones of the old had already decayed. If they continued to practice martial arts, they would only be asking for a snub. Meanwhile, the young had vigorous qi and blood. They had nowhere to vent their energy, especially those who were extremely energetic. Aside from women, they never thought of anything else. If these kinds of people cultivated the Tao, it would be strange if they didn't suffer from qi deviation. Although castration was cruel, from a rational point of view, it truly cut off all distracting thoughts and desires. For cultivators, it was truly of great benefit. Lu Jixing's fiendish decree had given rise to a large number of castrated people in Southern Han. At the same time, he had also indirectly created a large group of cultivators with profound magical power. This group of self-castrated Taoists and monks, after cultivating without any distracting thoughts, had their cultivation soar by leaps and bounds, attracting the attention of other cultivators. What? You're more formidable than me because you cut off your own balls? Are you kidding me? Fine, I'll do the same if you cut them off. During this period, the castrated sect of the cultivation world flourished. Among them, the most famous was Wang Chongyang's disciple, Taoist master Eternal Spring of the Chuanjin Dragon sect, Qiu Chuji. When Qiu Chuji founded the Dragon's Gate sect, he set down the doctrine of ascetic cultivation, advocating the extermination of desires and emotions. Not only did he set an example by waving his blade and castrating himself, he also did not close his eyes or sleep for 6 years. However, the castrated sect was not mainstream in the cultivation world. Many Taoists still wanted to marry and have children, carrying on the family line. How could they be willing to so easily cut off their own balls? This was especially true towards the end of the Ming and Qing dynasties, when all of Taoism declined, and the Taoist cultivators' desire to save themselves from extinction became the most important matter. Carrying on the family line was the most important task. As a result, Taoists began to cherish their bodies even more, no longer engaging in such castrating activities. It was also precisely because of this that the castrated sect slowly disappeared into the mortal world of history, forgotten by cultivators. Although Yen Fong herself had read a lot of classics, she was also a woman. Although she had occupied the body of her nephew's 7 treasures, the mainstream Taoist ideology of cherishing one's body and cherishing one's life occupied her main thoughts. How could she think of waving a blade and castrating herself? At this time, when she suddenly heard such a sentence, it was like seeing the light in the darkness and feeling the way out in the fog. Yes, I'm tortured to death by this yang qi every day. Why don't I just cut off the root of this yang qi and get it over with once and for all? Yen Fong's heart skipped a beat, and her eyes immediately shot out a determined look. She was a determined and courageous woman. As soon as she thought of this, she found a sharp knife, took off her clothes, and bit a towel in her mouth. After preparing the tools to stop the bleeding and disinfecting the knife, Yen Fong gritted her teeth and swung the knife from the pouch under her. Yen Fong's whole body shook violently, and she almost fainted from the pain. Blood kept flowing down her leg. No one knew that with this knife, the first Dongfang Bubi of modern China was born. The Super 4 group is full, don't add it in addition. There was indeed a castrated sect in Taoism, and whether Qiu Chuji was castrated is also controversial. But after looking through the information, I'm inclined to think that he was castrated. Finally, I updated very late. Sorry, Tang, I'm tired and went to bed. Good night, everyone. Chapter 759. While Yen Fong was castrating herself, Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Chris had already arrived at Harrisburg on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. Compared with other famous large cities in the United States, Harrisburg was much smaller, although it was the capital of a state. Except for Pennsylvania State University, which was known as the most famous university for cultivating entrepreneurs in the country, it could be said that there was almost nothing worth paying attention to in this city. Tens of thousands of people lived in this sparsely populated place. It was like sprinkling a handful of pepper into a pot of soup. Nothing could be seen. Except for people in the community and the main city, there were almost no signs of human habitation in other places. Su Chan and Zi Yuan didn't have passports, so it was naturally impossible for them to swagger on the plane with Chris. However, they couldn't fly all the way. After flying for tens of thousands of kilometers, even if they didn't vomit blood, they would be exhausted. Therefore, Su Chan and Zi Yuan successfully boarded the plane from Shanghai to Harrisburg under the cover of the goddess Nyan seal. Harrisburg was not a very famous place. There were not many people going there, and there were few flights. There were many empty seats on the plane. After Su Chan and Zi Yuan got on the plane, they found a place at random and sat down peacefully. They either meditated or closed their eyes to sleep. Anyway, the plane had taken off, and there was no such thing as passengers getting on halfway, so they didn't have to worry about being discovered. After the 3 of them got off the plane, Chris stopped a taxi. Instead of going home, she went straight to Harrisburg Hospital. This hospital was equivalent to a city hospital in China. It had 400 beds and was a first-class hospital with complete facilities. Chris was worried about the safety of her grandmother. Along the way, she didn't have time to introduce the customs of Harrisburg to Su Chan and Zi Yuan. She just looked out of the window, anxious to go home. Su Chan looked out of the window curiously. The scenery outside was in sharp contrast to the scenery of China, which was full of people and buildings. The first thing she saw was the extremely wide grass, as if she was in a grassland. After the taxi drove for a long time, they slowly entered the city. There were gradually more buildings around them, but there were not many tall buildings, which was very different from what Su Chan had expected. The driver was a black man. Along the way, he kept sneaking glances at Zi Yuan and Su Chan through the rearview mirror. These two beautiful women from the East had different appearances, but they were both stunning beauties, which really amazed him. The black man was talkative. Along the way, he tried to strike up a conversation with Su Chan and Zi Yuan several times, but the two of them didn't understand English and didn't want to show their timidity outside, so they turned their heads and looked out of the window, as if they didn't want strangers to come in. The black man had failed to strike up a conversation with Su Chan, so he had no choice but to settle for the next best thing. He turned his head and tried to strike up a conversation with Chris. Annoyed, Chris couldn't help but yell at him. Only then did the black man obediently start driving his car. However, it didn't take long for him to start playing black blues music again. He was humming unconsciously, which really annoyed Su Chan and the others. On the wide and empty asphalt road of Harrisburg, a taxi was driving fast, and from time to time, a burst of fast-paced rap music came from the window. They drove all the way to Harrisburg Hospital. Su Chan and the others ran out of the car as if they were fleeing for their lives. Su Chan patted her chest and said to Zi Yuan with a wry smile, "Sister Zi Yuan, this foreigner is too talkative, isn't he? He didn't stop talking all the way. I really want to poke his acupoints." Zi Yuan smiled and said, "I want to, too, but I can only think about it. This is not like our country. A little trouble here can lead to big trouble." Su Chan nodded and looked around carefully. At this time, after Chris had paid the bill, she came to their side, patted Su Chan's arm, and said, "Come, you guys come with me, over here." Su Chan and Zi Yuan followed Chris into Harrisburg Hospital. After entering the inpatient building, Chris asked the nurse on duty and went straight to her grandmother's care ward. Chris's family was considered a famous family in the local area, so Lin Guiying lived in a special care ward. It was a single room, spacious and bright, with a special senior nurse in charge of taking care of her. As soon as Chris entered the door, she saw a young woman and a well-dressed man sitting by Lin Guiying's bed. This young woman was Chris's biological sister, Kurt, and the man next to her was her husband. Kurt immediately stood up when he saw Chris. With a look of surprise on his face, he walked over to her, opened his arms, and hugged her tightly. "Oh, Chris, baby, I thought I would never see you again. Jim said that you were far away in China and didn't want to come back." Chris patted her on the back and kissed her on the cheek. Then, she hugged Kurt's husband and said in a low voice, "How is Grandma? Hasn't she always been in good health? Why did she suddenly?" As she spoke, Chris looked over and saw that Lin Guiying, who used to be able to jump on plum stacks as tall as a man, was now lying quietly on the hospital bed. There was a breathing tube connected to a ventilator in her mouth, and a nasal feeding tube connected to her nose to deliver liquid food. Her eyes were closed and her body was motionless. Her skin showed an extremely unhealthy paleness. If it weren't for the electrocardiogram monitor next to her showing a trace of life, Chris would have thought that Lin Guiying had died. Seeing her dearest grandmother like this, Chris's eyes were suddenly filled with tears. Kurt, who was at the side, sighed softly and said, "A few days ago, when Granny was practicing her martial arts on a wooden pole, she probably fell from it. When the servants found her, she had already been unconscious for a few hours. When she was sent to the hospital, the doctor said that it was a sudden cerebral thrombosis that caused her paralysis. Now she is in a vegetative state, and I don't know if she will wake up." Kurt had been studying abroad since he was a child, so he didn't have any deep feelings for Lin Guiying. However, Lin Guiying had a high status in the family. As a junior, he naturally had to come back to check on her. After explaining the situation in a low voice, she looked at Zi Yuan and Su Chan and motioned for Chris to introduce them. "Chris, who are these two?" Chris wiped away her tears and forced herself to calm down. "Sister, these are my two good friends in China. Her name is Su Chan, and her name is Zi Yuan." As she spoke, she introduced Kurt and her husband to Su Chan and Zi Yuan. After shaking hands politely and reservedly according to etiquette, Zi Yuan's eyes couldn't help but fall on Lin Guiying. After looking at her carefully for a while, she suddenly frowned and reached out to touch Lin Guiying's wrist. Kurt's husband shouted subconsciously, trying to stop Zi Yuan. "Hey, be careful. She's a seriously ill patient in front of you." Zi Yuan didn't understand what he was saying, so she just glanced at him faintly. This glance stunned Kurt's husband, and he almost lost his composure on the spot because of Zi Yuan's amazing appearance. When he came to his senses, he shrugged his shoulders awkwardly, indicating that he would not stop her. Kurt saw Zi Yuan press Lin Guiying's pulse with her hand, then explore her neck and heart. She couldn't help but pull Chris aside and whisper, "Chris, who are they? What are they doing here?" Chris's eyes were full of hope as she stared at Zi Yuan, as if she was eager to see a trace of good news from Zi Yuan's face in the next second. She said casually, "They are all very powerful doctors." "Well, they can also be considered doctors." Kurt slapped her forehead. "Damn it, what do you mean by they can also be considered doctors?" "Hey, Chris, I know that you have been very obsessed with China since you were a child, but you don't have to provoke the Chinese for such a thing, do you?" The beauty of Su Chan and Zi Yuan was extremely amazing, transcending any racial prejudice and national boundaries. Even the strongest racist would be shocked by their amazing beauty when they saw Zi Yuan and Su Chan. Kurt was naturally aware of her husband's absent-minded state. She herself could be considered a beautiful woman. Suddenly seeing her husband fall head over heels in love with these two peerless beauties, she was naturally extremely displeased, and a great sense of disgust arose in her heart. Chris was worried about the safety of her grandmother, so she didn't pay much attention to her sister's thoughts. She said casually, "It's okay. Let them see. There can't be a worse situation than this. They should have a way." Kurt knew that although her sister was younger than her, she was determined and very strong-willed. It was difficult for anyone to change her mind once she decided on something. She was unhappy and muttered in a low voice, "Humph, these ignorant Chinese people know nothing but selling fake goods and playing kung fu." Chris glanced at her quickly. She was not in the mood to argue with her sister here. She walked over to Zi Yuan and asked in a low voice, "Zi Yuan, how is my grandmother?" Zi Yuan withdrew her hand and looked at Chris. She quickly glanced at Kurt and her husband with some scruples. Chris knew what she meant and quickly said in Chinese, "It's okay. They don't understand Chinese. Just tell me directly." Zi Yuan nodded. "Chris, I have good news and bad news, as well as good news that is neither good nor bad. Which one do you want to hear first?" Chris said without hesitation, "Listen to the good news first." Zi Yuan smiled slightly. "The good news is, your grandmother didn't have a cerebral thrombosis. It's just that the symptoms are very similar." Chris beamed with joy. "Yes, my grandmother is in good health. She was practicing boxing before the disease broke out. My sister said that she fell from the plum blossom stump." "Plum blossom stump?" Zi Yuan looked at Lin Guiying, who was lying in the hospital bed, and said, "It turns out that she practiced plum blossom boxing. No wonder your grandmother is so old, but her internal organs are very healthy and strong. Among the elderly, she is very good." Chris took a deep breath and said, "Well, I've heard the good news. It's time to tell the bad news." Seeing that she was like an uneasy prisoner waiting to be sentenced, Zi Yuan couldn't help but smile and comfort her. "Don't be so nervous. It's not that bad. The bad news is that your grandmother isn't sick, but she's been cursed by someone." "Ah." Chris and Su Chan were shocked at the same time. Su Chan hurriedly rushed to Lin Guiying's side, opened her eyelids to take a look, and then reached out to test her meridians. Kurt frowned and wanted to interrupt them, but he couldn't because of Chris. He could only stare at Zi Yuan and Su Chan sullenly. Su Chan took a quick look and returned to Zi Yuan's side in surprise. She said to Chris, "It's the soul-stealing spell. This is a Taoist magic. Did your grandmother offend some cultivators?" Chris looked confused. "No, my grandmother lives in seclusion and has always been kind to others. How could she have offended anyone?" Ziyuan shook her head slightly. Now let me tell you the good news. The soul-detaching spell that your grandma was afflicted with was very powerful, and only masters could cast it. This was bad news, but the good news was that to maintain the spell, one could not be too far away. In other words, the furthest she could go was near Harrisburg. Moreover, your grandmother is still alive, which means that the person who used it is still in Harrisburg. Chris was confused. She really couldn't understand why such a thing would happen in the distant United States. Who on earth was this Taoist cultivator of unknown origin? Why did he attack her grandmother? Chapter 760. Chris looked puzzled and couldn't help asking Ziyuan, what kind of magic is this soul-stealing spell? Ziyuan pulled Chris's arm and motioned for her to walk over to Lin Guiying. She said softly, in the eyes of Taoist cultivators, people have 3 souls and 7 spirits. The 3 souls are the heaven soul, the earth soul, and the life soul, also known as the embryo light, the refreshing spirit, and the nether spirit. The 7 spirits are Tianchong, Linghui, Central Center, Qi, Li, Jing, and Ning, also known as the devouring thief, the dead dog, the eliminating filth, the smelly lung, the sparrow Yin, the non-poison, and the hidden arrow. As she spoke, Ziyuan pointed to Lin Guiying and said, your grandmother only has the life soul of the 3 souls left, which is the refreshing spirit, which is in charge of the 5 elements. Of the 7 spirits, only 1 is left, which is the eliminating filth spirit, which maintains the metabolism of the human body. The other 6 spirits have been dispersed and are nowhere to be found. Chris said anxiously, then how can I save my grandmother? Do I have to find the caster? Do I need to kill him? Ziyuan shook her head and said, if it's just witchcraft, killing the caster will naturally remove the magic, but our Taoist magic is not like this. Although this magic needs to be maintained, the reason why it needs to be maintained is that it has to be controlled all the time so that the victim's 3 souls and 7 spirits will not scatter between heaven and earth and can no longer be summoned back. Most of the people who can use this magic are masters. And if this person really has a grudge against your grandmother, he can completely shatter your grandmother's 3 souls and 7 spirits at once. He doesn't have to make your grandmother into a vegetable like she is now, neither dead nor alive. Chris was also an extremely smart person. Her eyes lit up and she said, you mean this person doesn't want my grandmother's life? Ziyuan nodded slightly. Yes, if I'm not mistaken, this person should want to use your grandmother to threaten you or your family. Su Chan suddenly said, it's also possible that he wants to take this opportunity to get close to you. For example, he pretended to cast a spell on your grandmother and then helped her remove it, so that you would be grateful and trust him. When Chris heard this, her heart couldn't help but tremble. Her face was gloomy and uncertain. She gritted her teeth and said in a low voice, what you said makes sense. It's very likely. However, which cultivator would want to do this to me or our family? We didn't offend them. Su Chan looked at her worriedly, then turned to Ziyuan and said, Sister Ziyuan, do you know any powerful cultivators and cultivation sects abroad? Ziyuan shook her head and said, I don't know. There was a trace of connection between the domestic cultivation world and the foreign cultivation world 30 or 40 years ago, but slowly, the connection between the two became less and less. Gradually, they became 2 schools of thought. They both said that they were the right way and accused each other of being the worst. No one was convinced by the other. Even the foreign cultivation world shouted that the masters were abroad, and they sneered at the domestic cultivators and disdained them. Su Chan also nodded slightly and said, yes, I saw the internal conflict between the Shantian sect and the Juni school a while ago. At that time, I also felt that the Shantian sect was very powerful and seemed to have many masters. By the way, Sister Ziyuan, do you think it could be the Shantian sect? Ziyuan thought for a moment and said, I don't know, but it shouldn't be. The 2 of them were talking in low voices. Kurt's eyes were wide open and she was confused. She didn't know what they were talking about. She grabbed Chris and said unhappily, Chris, What are you talking about with your Chinese friends? Chris hesitated for a moment, but she still didn't tell her sister the news. Her mind raced and she soon came up with an idea. They said that Grandma's disease is incurable, and they can't do anything about it. Kurt snorted. That's obvious. It would be strange if they could cure Grandma. Chris thought for a moment and said, Sister, I want to hold a banquet in the name of praying for Grandma. What do you think? By the way, I want to contact everyone and see if they have any good ideas. It's also good to brainstorm. Kurt hesitated for a moment. A banquet? She looked at the unconscious Lin Guiying and said, It's not good for Grandma to be like this, is it? Chris said, That's why it's being held in the name of praying for blessings. Why don't you inform our relatives and friends, and then inform other people in the nearby community? What do you think? While Kurt was still hesitating, her husband suddenly had an idea. He thought that since there was going to be a banquet, maybe Chris's 2 beautiful Chinese girls would also attend. At that time, he would have a chance to get to know them. As soon as this idea came to his mind, Kurt's husband said, Kurt, that's a good idea. Kurt didn't know what her husband was thinking. After being persuaded, she didn't insist. She just said, I have to go back and listen to my father and mother's opinions. Then, she picked up her cell phone and dialed a number. Chris didn't comment. In her opinion, even if her father and mother didn't agree, she would hold the banquet in her own name. After Kurt walked aside to make the call, she walked back and smiled at Chris. Chris, my father and mother have agreed. Chris smiled, turned to Ziyuan and Su Chan, and said in Chinese, Now it's all right. I've held a banquet. If someone is really plotting against me behind my back, he will definitely come to my banquet and jump out in a hurry. Ziyuan nodded approvingly and said, That's a good idea. It's a good method. Su Chan also said with a smile, This person definitely won't expect us to be standing behind you. The 3 of them smiled at each other, as if they could already see the shock and surprise on the other party's face after their scheme had been exposed. However, Su Chan and Ziyuan had never expected who was standing behind this mastermind. Westerners had a strong sense of independence. Many of them would choose to move out as soon as they had the financial ability after they reached adulthood. Chris was the same. Although she often went to Lin Guiying's house in the garden to have fun, her own house was in a spacious green lawn not far away. Chris had a small 3-story villa. Compared with ordinary people's wooden houses that could be dismantled and transported, the villa she lived in was made of stone. The front yard was a wide and flat lawn, and there was a circle of flowers in the middle of the lawn. A middle-aged Asian woman was kneeling beside the flower bed through a cloth towel, carefully trimming and arranging the flowers. When Chris returned to her home with Ziyuan and Su Chan, she first greeted the Asian woman. Aunt Wang, I'm back. The Asian woman turned around and looked at Chris in surprise, saying, Chris, why are you back? I heard from Jim that you weren't coming back. Chris forced a smile. Grandma is sick. Of course, I have to come back to see her. There were almost no tall buildings in the community in the United States, and the neighbors were very close to each other, completely unlike the modern cities in China, where the neighbors never contacted each other. As soon as Chris's voice sounded, the surrounding neighbors rushed out one after another and greeted Chris warmly. At the same time, they looked at Su Chan and Ziyuan curiously. After Chris responded to them one by one, she took Su Chan and Ziyuan into her home. At this time, in a villa not far from Chris, Han Zhen slowly put down the curtain in front of him and smiled coldly. In order to pursue Chris, he had specially bought this villa here at a high price, just to get close to her first. Now that he saw that Chris had finally returned as he had wished, he was so proud that he wanted to rush out and greet her immediately, but he held back and thought proudly, Don't worry, Chris. It's not the best time to greet you yet. When I appear in front of you again, you will cry and beg me to save your grandma. Han Zhen looked back proudly and said respectfully, Master, what should we do next? The person standing in front of Han Zhen was none other than Su Ling, a Jinshan master who had once shown off his power on Tiandu Peak. Standing next to him was the blind Taoist priest, Su Kong, who had stabbed his eyes in order to save his Shixiang. Su Ling sat on the sofa, waved his hand, and said with a big smile, "You designed the plan yourself. Why are you asking me? I only care about casting magic. I don't care about anything else." As he said this, his eyes narrowed and he said coldly, "I told you in advance that the donation you promised can't be less than a penny." After the Battle of Tiandu Peak that day, Su Ling and Su Kong were defeated by the heavenly thunder of the Thunder Retribution Master. The two of them also knew that the Battle of Tiandu Peak had offended all the major sects in the Chinese cultivation world, so they did not dare to stay on the mainland any longer. In a flash, they ran to Southeast Asia to hide. On the one hand, they could find the power of Zenkingism in Southeast Asia, so that it would be convenient for them to seize power in the future. On the other hand, they could also recuperate from their injuries and plot again. Although Su Ling and Su Kong were pleasantly surprised to find that Zenkingism still had power in Southeast Asia, and it was quite powerful, when they went to look for them, they soon couldn't laugh anymore. Su Ling was domineering and overbearing, so naturally, his attitude would not be very good when he went to look for them. In addition, in his opinion, when a senior like him came, the younger generation should hurry out to welcome him. But the truth was completely the opposite. In the eyes of the followers of Zenkingism in Southeast Asia, regardless of whether the identities of Su Ling and Su Kong were true or not, they would never tolerate a person who had suddenly appeared and tried to stand on their heads. Even if this person was their senior, they would still slap him down. As the saying goes, the new waves of the Yangtze River push the old waves, and the old waves die on the beach. Why didn't they stay on the beach? Why did they come to Southeast Asia? Did they want to die? Su Ling was arrogant and bad-tempered. On the other side, he was also suspicious. In such a situation, it was naturally impossible for them to talk together. After a few words, the two sides started fighting. Su Ling's own injuries had not healed, and he and his junior brother were beaten until they covered their heads and fled. In the end, they ran around and finally exiled to a place called Harrisburg on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. These two guys, whose thinking was still stuck in the chaotic period of the Republic of China, thought that with their own strength on this land, it would be a matter of minutes if they wanted to fight for a territory. Therefore, they showed the banner of Zenkingism and looked for the local gangs to fight. However, the gang that Su Ling and Su Kong chose was the Han family. At this time, Han Zhen came back from China. When he heard that these two Taoist priests dared to cause trouble, he immediately picked a dozen people with all kinds of guns to cause trouble for Su Ling and Su Kong. Su Ling and Su Kong were also very straightforward. They started a big fight with Han Zhen's people. Needless to say, although Han Zhen had guns in his hand, he was naturally defeated when he met a Jinshan master and a Yang spirit master. However, Su Ling and Su Kong also knew what was important and did not kill them. They only forced Han Zhen to give up his territory or pay a membership fee. Han Zhen was depressed and wronged. When a gangster met someone who was even more evil than him, he had no way to reason with them. However, he also reacted very quickly. He immediately bowed to Su Ling and shamelessly took him as his master. Su Ling was addicted to accepting disciples, so he naturally waved his hand and happily accepted him. It was also because he had seen Su Ling's remarkable ability that Han Zhen had an idea. That was why Lin Guiying was seriously ill, and Chris was eager to return home. Hearing what Su Ling said to him, Han Zhen said respectfully, "Master, don't worry. When the time comes, not only will I not give you a penny less, but I may even earn you another believer. For example, a family that controls the light industry in Harrisburg. What do you think?" When Su Ling heard this, he was overjoyed. He looked at his disciple, who was smiling, and laughed. The two of them had ulterior motives. They felt that they were the mantis stalking the cicada, unaware of the oriole behind it. Zi Yuan and Su Chan, who lived opposite them, also wanted to be the mantis stalking the cicada. However, neither of them knew that this time, the few people who had fought fiercely on Tiandu Peak had gone around the earth and bumped into each other again. It suddenly occurred to me that recently, the online literature world had been cracking down on transmigration. The reason was that there was a child who wanted to commit suicide in the novel. As a result, he wanted to transmigrate, so he committed suicide. Well, in view of the chapter about wanting to practice the divine kung fu and castrating himself with a knife, I have to say, children should not learn it. You don't want to see this book be harmonized, do you? Chapter 761. The banquet that Chris held at her home kicked off the next evening. It was a banquet for more than 100 people. Since the community had a business organization that was responsible for hosting banquets and a housekeeper was in charge of organizing it, Chris didn't have to worry too much. All she had to do was take care of herself. In order to avoid missing out on the mastermind behind the scenes, Chris invited almost everyone who was related to her to the banquet. She even invited some of her classmates from school, including Han Zhen. When Han Zhen received Chris's invitation letter, he was so excited that he almost jumped up. It was as if he could already see a snow-white lamb walking step by step into his trap. That night, he deliberately dressed up very well. He was dressed in a suit and leather shoes. The leather shoes on his feet shone brightly, and his hair was combed back as if it had been plowed. Han Zhen raised a goblet with a smile on his face. He looked at Chris, who was chatting with the crowd. His eyes were as sharp as a beast staring at its prey. Chris was wearing a plain white, slanted dress that revealed half of her smooth shoulders and the snow-white skin on her chest. Because her grandmother was hospitalized, she had specially pinned a black flower on her shoulder, which made her look solemn, noble, and elegant. The guests also knew about Chris's situation. Many of them came up to her to comfort her and pray at the Christ statue in the middle of the hall. Chris's parents were devout Christians, but Chris herself was not. She was deeply influenced by Lin Guiying and did not believe in Christianity. However, only a few people in the family knew this. In their eyes, if the parents were Christians, how could the child not be? But Chris was not. It was precisely because of this that when she held this banquet, no one noticed anything wrong. Han Zhen stared at Chris for a long time. When he saw that Chris had finished dealing with the last customer, she leaned against the table and sighed softly. Her expression was full of exhaustion. Han Zhen knew that this was the best time for him to appear. "Hi, Chris, you're finally back. I thought you wouldn't come back." Han Zhen stepped forward with a glass of wine in his hand. With a sincere look on his face, he greeted them enthusiastically in fluent English. On one hand, Chris had to deal with so many people on the scene, and on the other hand, she had to constantly observe their expressions and movements to figure out which one was the mastermind behind the scourge of her grandmother. It seems simple, but in fact, it took a lot of effort. Why did most cultivators keep a low profile and live in seclusion? The reason was that they were unwilling to deal with things like dealing with people. The most tiring and annoying thing in the world was dealing with people, not to mention scheming and guessing at people's hearts. Because of this, each sect in the cultivation world often had a person who had a strong voice. This person was responsible for almost all the external affairs of the sect. It could be said that he was the diplomat of the sect, such as Zhang Ling of the Jingyi school, Du Fei of the Chuanjin Dragon sect, and Wang Jinyuan of the Gazao sect. In these sects, there were many people with higher cultivation levels than them, but when it came to speaking to the outside world, they were the ones who stood up to speak. It was not only because of their personalities and their innate ability to deal with people, but also because the higher the cultivation level of a cultivator, the more they liked to hide. They did not like to come into contact with complicated things and complicated human nature. Whether it was Zhang Ling, Du Fei, or Wang Jinyuan, they all had one most obvious characteristic: their cultivation levels were not high. This was because a large part of their energy was wasted on dealing with people. Chris had received dozens of people in a row. It was as if she had fought with people several times in a row. She was so tired that she almost wanted to lie in bed and not move. But when she saw Han Zhen coming over at this time, she had to brace herself and deal with him. Han Zhen was of medium height, handsome and gentle. He was dressed in expensive clothes and wore a pair of black-rimmed glasses on his face, which perfectly set off his dignified, noble, and restrained temperament. In terms of appearance alone, Han Zhen was not inferior to any movie star. Although he was Asian, his rich family background and handsome appearance made him have many suitors at Pennsylvania State University. Unfortunately, Chris knew Han Zhen very well. She knew that this man had a shrewdness that did not match his age. He would do anything to achieve his goals. He was a man who had no bottom line or morality at all. It was because she had long seen through this that Chris had always kept a respectful distance from Han Zhen's pursuit. Many girls who pursued Han Zhen but failed became more and more jealous of Chris because of this, thinking that she was a whore who only knew how to pretend to be virtuous. But only Chris knew that when she observed Han Zhen up close, she could see a deeply hidden possessiveness in the man's eyes. And today, the strange light in Han Zhen's eyes made Chris feel particularly vigilant. Chris forced a smile and said in fluent Chinese, "The weather is unpredictable, and people have their ups and downs. How can I decide whether I come back or not?" Seeing that she was speaking to him in Chinese, Han Zhen had no choice but to say in not very fluent Chinese, "I remember there is a saying, the moon has its ups and downs." What? D***M. How can this saying be used? Chris smiled slightly and said, "The moon has its ups and downs, and people have their sorrows and sorrows and reunions." This is Su Dongpa's Shuidiao Getu, one of my favorite poems. Han Zhen couldn't help but compliment her. "Chris, your Chinese is so good. You really make me feel ashamed." "My Chinese is so good?" Chris muttered in her heart, and her expression became a little strange. She couldn't help but think of Li Yundong's evaluation of her. "Your Chinese is at most at the level of a 5th or 6th grader in primary school. If you can cultivate to the primary level of the Jinshan, it will be the limit because you don't understand the real traditional culture of China. You don't know what the unity of heaven and man is, and what the infinite void is. My level of a 5th or 6th grader in primary school is really good." Then what level is this Han Zhen? For a moment, Chris felt that it was very absurd. She, a blonde foreign girl, had been sincerely praised by this black-haired, black-eyed Chinese man in front of her for her excellent Chinese, and he, a Chinese man of pure Chinese descent, couldn't even finish a Shuidiao Getu. On the other hand, she, a foreign devil who had been criticized by Li Yundong as being at the level of a primary school student, had continued. This was really an ironic scene full of black humor. Han Zhen saw that Chris's smile was a little strange and her eyes were flickering, as if she was thinking about something, but he didn't think too much about it. He didn't believe that this prey could jump out of his palm. He smiled and said, "Chris, don't worry about your grandmother. I believe that after the worst comes the best, your grandmother will get better." At this time, Chris also came to her senses. She smiled slightly, raised her glass to Han Zhen, and said, "Thank you for your kindness. Cheers." After they clinked their glasses and took a sip, Chris suddenly asked, "By the way, Han Zhen, do you know any good way to save my grandmother? You know, the best doctors in Pennsylvania have been invited, but they are all at a loss. Maybe you have a good doctor that you can recommend to me?" Chris had said this to almost everyone before, and the guests she had invited naturally knew the purpose of Chris's banquet, so they had done their homework early. Chris had received a thick stack of business cards. However, most of the business cards were famous doctors from famous cities such as New York, Washington, and Los Angeles, but there was no answer that Chris was looking for. But when she said these words to Han Zhen mechanically, Han Zhen couldn't help but be ecstatic. "Wow, I was just worried about how to say it, and you actually came to me. Then I won't stand on ceremony." The strange look in Han Zhen's eyes made the tired Chris immediately put up her guard. Her heart suddenly skipped a beat, and she stared at Han Zhen as if she had noticed something. In fact, Chris had listed Han Zhen as the most suspicious target at first, but then she thought about it and felt that although Han Zhen had a bad character, there was no doubt that he was smart and cunning. He would not do such a thing at such a critical juncture. Once she found out, her disgust for him would definitely escalate to hatred. It was impossible for him not to have thought of this. However, Chris had not expected that Han Zhen would actually run into Su Ling and Su Ku. Moreover, Han Zhen had only known that Chris had gone to China, but he did not know that Chris had gone to China to study cultivation. Therefore, when he had run into a cultivator, he had thought that he was the only lucky person in the world who knew about such a powerful character. Therefore, Han Zhen had only covered up this matter a little at the beginning, but then he had swaggered out and stood up without any scruples. One was a little presumptuous, while the other was self-righteous. The two sides had accidentally come together, resulting in the current situation. The most suspicious person had been let go by Chris, but in the end, after a round of investigation, the suspect had still fallen on this guy. Han Zhen pretended to be hesitant and said, "Chris, I do have a way, but..." Seeing his abnormality, Chris became more and more vigilant in her heart, but she did not show it on her face. Instead, she asked anxiously, "But what?" Han Zhen looked around and said in a low voice, pretending to be mysterious, "I know a very powerful Taoist priest. He should be able to cure your grandmother's illness. Are you interested in meeting him?" It really was him. Hearing this, Chris was shocked. She immediately clenched the wine glass in her hand so hard that she almost crushed it in an instant. However, she came from a famous family and was very shrewd. She forcibly suppressed the anger in her heart and showed a puzzled expression on her face. A Taoist priest? A Taoist priest can cure diseases? Seeing Chris's expression, Han Zhen was not surprised but happy. He said with a smile, "I knew you would react like this. When I first saw this Taoist priest, I had the same thought as you. Hey, Chris, although you know China well, you probably don't know how many magical powers these Taoist priests have, do you?" Chris sneered in her heart and thought to herself, "If I tell you about the fighting methods I've seen in China, you will be scared to death." However, she deliberately said disapprovingly, "Is that so?" Han Zhen waved his hand and said mysteriously, "Chris, if you don't believe me, come with me to see it." "How about it?" "It's at my house. It's not far from here." Chris hesitated for a moment and quickly glanced upstairs. She saw Zi Yuan, who was secretly looking at her through the gap of a half-hidden door upstairs, nodding gently at her. Chris immediately made up her mind and said to Han Zhen, "Okay, take me to see it." Han Zhen was overjoyed and said with a smile, "You definitely won't be disappointed." Chris sneered in her heart, but she forced a smile on her face. "I hope so." After saying goodbye to some of the acquaintances at the banquet, they went to Han Zhen's house. Their houses were quite close, so it would only take them 2 or 3 minutes to get there. At this time, Su Chan and Zi Yuan, who had been hiding in the dark and watching Chris, looked at each other and followed her from a distance. The two of them knew that Chris must have found the real mastermind at this time. They didn't know who this mastermind was, what his identity was, or what his strength was. Therefore, they were more vigilant and carefully restrained their auras. Under the cover of the goddess Nyan seal, they followed Chris and sneaked into Han Zhen's house. After entering Han Zhen's house, Su Chan and Zi Yuan saw a man in a Taoist robe with his hair combed into a high bun, with his back to them. Su Chan immediately tugged at Zi Yuan's sleeve and asked her with her eyes, as if to say, "Sister Zi Yuan, this is the person, right?" When Zi Yuan saw the figure of this person, she vaguely felt that he was a little familiar, but she was not sure. She secretly transmitted a voice message, "It should be him. Be careful." At this time, the Taoist seemed to have noticed that Chris and Han Zhen had returned. He turned around and laughed. "Good disciple, you're back?" As soon as the man turned around, Chris was so scared that her legs trembled. She subconsciously wanted to turn around and run. She had a deep impression of this person. This was the devil-like Su Ling who had killed everyone on Tiandu Peak. Even Li Yundong, Zi Yuan, Zhou Qin, and Su Chan couldn't do anything to him. When Zi Yuan and Su Chan saw him, they were so scared that their hearts almost jumped out of their chests. They thought in their minds at the same time, "Isn't the earth too small?" There will be another chapter in a while. It will probably be around 12:30 p.m. Those who can't wait can go to sleep first. Chapter 762. If they went back 2 months, Su Ling was really an unbeatable super boss for Li Yunyang, Zi Yuan, and the others. Not only did he have a lot of blood, thick skin, and fast regeneration, but his attack power was also super strong. The most abnormal thing was that after injuring him, he would go berserk and use a large-scale indiscriminate magic attack, which was almost an instant kill. Such an opponent was really a nightmare, and they really couldn't afford to hurt him. Fortunately, after the battle at Tiandu Peak, Zi Yuan finally broke through the bottleneck and cultivated to the Jinshin phase. Although she had not fought a real Jinshin battle with anyone yet, she was still a Jinshin master. Su Chan had also broken through to the seven-tailed fox spirit realm. Although she was not yet in the Jinshin phase, once a fox demon cultivated to the top phase of the Yang spirit, once she revealed her true body, with the unique characteristics of long hair, thick skin, and immunity to many magic of the fox demon, she also had the strength to compete with a Jinshin master. Although it was unlikely that she could win, at least she would not be like an ordinary Yang spirit master, who had no room to fight back. But even if the two of them had broken through to such a realm, they were still scared when they suddenly saw Su Ling. During the battle at Tiandu Peak, Su Ling had left a deep impression on them. Although this guy was a little arrogant, his strength was definitely not for show. He was extremely fierce in fighting. He had suppressed hundreds of cultivators by himself and beaten them so fiercely that Zi Yuan and the others didn't have any temper at all. That was not something that anyone could do. As soon as Su Chan saw Su Ling, she immediately grabbed Zi Yuan with her hand. Her eyes were wide open, and her frightened eyes seemed to be saying, "Sister Zi Yuan, what should we do?" Zi Yuan had never dreamed that after flying tens of thousands of kilometers to the distant Harrisburg, they would actually meet Su Ling. There was a touch of fear in Zi Yuan's eyes. The psychological shadow left by the battle at Tiandu Peak was really a little big. She suddenly saw Su Ling in this unfamiliar place. It would be a lie to say that she was not afraid, but after all, she was not an ordinary person. She calmed down in a moment and sent a voice transmission to Chris, "Don't worry. He definitely hasn't found us, and he doesn't necessarily know about Chris's situation." Sure enough, after glancing at Chris, Su Ling did not show any abnormality, as if it was the first time he had seen her. Su Chan secretly admired Zi Yuan. Zi Yuan's speculation is not wrong at all. She can still accurately speculate the situation in such an extremely shocked situation. It's really amazing. At this time, she also understood that although Chris had seen Su Ling in the Battle of Sky Capital Peak, it did not mean that Su Ling could recognize her. At that time, Su Ling had suppressed everyone by himself. Naturally, they all remembered Su Ling. However, Su Ling had dealt with so many people alone, and it had been the middle of the night. How could everyone recognize him? Su Chan and Zi Yuan could understand this, but Chris was a little confused for a moment. She looked at Su Ling with fear in her eyes, as if she was looking at a devil that had crawled out of the blood pool of hell. Her eyes and expression made Su Ling realize that something was wrong. The paranoid Su Ling could not help but turn his eyes back and stare at her carefully with a suspicious look on his face. Zi Yuan immediately became alert. She sent a voice transmission to Chris, "Chris, don't look at me. This Su Ling hasn't found you. Don't expose yourself." Chris's body trembled slightly. She was also an extremely smart woman, so she quickly reacted. She lowered her eyes and quickly concealed her emotions. At this time, Su Ling also looked at her suspiciously and suddenly said, "Do you know me?" Chris raised her head, and there was no longer the strange fear in her eyes. She forced a smile and said, "I don't know you." Su Ling's eyes became more and more puzzled. "Then why are you so afraid of me?" Chris suddenly had an idea and said, "You have a kind of frightening aura on you. I don't dare to approach you." These words made Su Ling laugh proudly. The suspicion in his heart disappeared. He walked forward with a smile and said, "Don't be afraid. I'm a very easygoing person." When Chris saw him coming over, she was so nervous that all the hair on her body stood on end. She couldn't help clenching her fists. Even though Zi Yuan was by her side, she couldn't stop her fear from spreading rapidly throughout her body. In the face of such a demon who killed people without blinking an eye, it was still uncertain whether Zi Yuan and Su Chan could beat him. Now, his grandmother's life was obviously in his hands. Not only had he failed to save his grandmother, but he was also about to lose his own life. In such a situation, who wouldn't be afraid? Although Su Ling was pleased by Chris' flattering words, he was soon suspicious of Chris' abnormal vigilance. At this time, a Taoist priest with a black cloth covering his eyes walked out from the inner room. It was none other than Jiao Buli Meng, Meng Buli Su Kong. Although Su Kong was blind, he seemed to be able to see the surrounding scenery. He walked around the furniture and sofa in the living room, walked up to Su Ling, and whispered a few words in his ear. Su Ling's eyes flashed, and he said to Chris, "Did my disciple mention me to you?" Han Zhen, who had been unable to get a word in, said, "Master, Chris's grandmother is seriously ill. I want to ask you to take a look at her. What do you think?" Su Ling said to Chris with a fake smile, "Do you believe me?" Chris hesitated for a moment and did not speak. Her reaction was within Han Zhen and Su Ling's expectations. If it had been anyone else, it would have been strange if they had been in Chris's shoes and said that they believed her at this time. Su Ling nodded and said, "You haven't seen a cultivator like me before, have you?" Chris hesitated for a moment, afraid that Su Ling would recognize that she had appeared on Tian Peak, so she nodded and said, "No." At this time, Su Ling's eyes flashed, and he quickly grabbed Chris's hand and said, "Oh? Then let me see how you are." Chris was already nervous and afraid. Seeing Su Ling grab her, she immediately trembled with fear. She reflexively took a step back and withdrew her hand. Although she reacted quickly, Su Ling's hand quickly brushed past her wrist. In just this moment, Su Ling's Jinqi immediately invaded Chris's body. Although Chris lacked systematic and formal cultivation, she had been transformed by the Diyuan Jin Dan, and the essence, qi, and blood in her body were extremely strong. As soon as Su Ling's Jinqi probed, the aura in her body immediately bounced back. Su Ling was just testing, so he only used 20% of his strength, but it was bounced back by a foreigner. Su Ling was shocked, and then he became furious. His fingers were like hooks as he grabbed at Chris fiercely. "You're lying. You're a cultivator. How dare you lie in front of me? You're courting death." Chris was so frightened that her beautiful face turned pale. She turned around and ran back wildly. At this time, Zi Yuan also appeared in an instant. The ninth heaven Zi Yuan's silk suddenly turned into a purple flash of lightning, like an extremely sharp awl, stabbing towards Su Ling's palm. After Zi Yuan had broken through to the Jinshin phase, her personal powerful magical weapon had also improved. In the world, only the Jinshin could break it. In the past, the ninth heaven Zi Yuan's silk could not break it, but now it was different. If Su Ling grabbed it with his bare hands, his palm and arm would be drilled a bloody hole by the ninth heaven Zi Yuan's silk. Su Ling only felt a gust of wind stabbing toward his palm, which made his hair stand on end. Obviously, this gust of wind had the effect of breaking armor. Otherwise, he would not have been so vigilant. Su Ling subconsciously withdrew his hand and stepped back. When he took a closer look, he suddenly became angry and said with a ferocious smile, "Well, it's you. There's a way to heaven, but you don't want to go to hell." In the Battle of Tiandu Peak, Su Ling had a deep impression of Zi Yuan. Although his previous fierce attacks had been blocked by Li Yunyang, in addition to the heavenly thunder and the Hell Wuzhang enchanting jade, Zi Yuan's powerful magical weapon, the ninth heaven Zi Yuan's silk, had really hurt him. At this time, seeing this powerful magical weapon again, it was really like seeing an enemy. Su Ling shouted, "Shirdi, catch this foreign girl." The void immediately shot towards Chris like a cannonball. Chris had an excellent cauldron and exuberant chi and blood, but she didn't know the way of cultivation and cultivation techniques. She could only watch as the void rushed towards her, unable to move at all. At this time, Su Chan immediately appeared and slapped Su Kong's back. Although Su Kong was blind, his sensitivity and vigilance were multiplied. He sensed a strong gust of wind coming from behind him and immediately turned his hand to slap Su Chan. With a muffled "pa" sound, the two of them were instantly separated. As soon as Su Chan landed on the ground, she shouted at Chris, "Chris, run. Go where there are many people." Chris shivered and immediately turned around to run outside. At this time, Han Zhen, who was stunned, also came to his senses. He gritted his teeth and ran after Chris. When Ziyuan saw Su Ling pouncing on her with a grim smile, she immediately controlled the ninth heaven Ziyuan silk and stabbed it at Su Ling. After Ziyuan had cultivated to the Jinshan phase, the strongest thing about her was that the ninth heaven Ziyuan silk had also been upgraded. It could break through the Jinshan phase and change into a myriad of powerful magical weapons. It was really a little powerful. Even Li Yunyang would have a headache when facing it. However, Su Ling had an even more abnormal powerful magical weapon in his hand, Yu Huang Xiandu, which could restrain all powerful magical weapons. Seeing the ninth heaven Ziyuan silk coming at him aggressively, Su Ling immediately took out a black jade ring from his sleeve and threw it forward. After Su Ling took out the Yu Huang Xiandu, it immediately stopped in midair. The ninth heaven Ziyuan silk hit it and immediately stopped moving. No matter how hard Ziyuan tried, it didn't move at all. These two powerful magical weapons seemed to have stopped in a confined space. No one's Jinshi could break in, and no one's powerful magical weapon could intervene, let alone their own thoughts and divine senses. When Ziyuan saw that the ninth heaven Ziyuan silk had been restrained by Yu Huang Xiandu, her face suddenly changed, and a trace of fear flashed in her eyes. The two powerful magical weapons she had carried with her before had been destroyed by Li Yunyang. It could be said that half of her strength in the fight now lay in this ninth heaven Ziyuan silk. She didn't know the mantra Mahamudra like Li Yunyang, so she could beat her opponent with her bare hands. Powerful magical weapons were the weapons of cultivators. At this time, her weapons had been confiscated, so Ziyuan didn't dare to fight with Su Ling. Without thinking about it, she immediately sent a voice transmission to Su Chan, "Let's go." The two of them rushed forward with great tacit understanding, making a posture of fighting desperately, causing Su Ling and Su Kong to put on a defensive posture for a moment. However, they soon stopped and disappeared in the blink of an eye, fleeing. Su Ling was stunned, and then he became furious. B****, how dare you trick me? Chase. Even if I have to chase you to the ends of the earth, I will kill these two B****. Chapter 763. Following Su Chan's instructions, Chris ran back to her home. Although she didn't know the way of cultivation, her physical strength was tyrannical, and her essence, chi, and blood were abundant. She was already considered rare in this world. Despite her fear, Chris's speed did not decrease. Instead, it increased. It only took a few steps for her to reach her lawn. Ignoring the guests who were playing on the lawn and greeting her, she rushed into her room. As soon as she entered the hall, she saw that it was full of guests. Some of these people were from the upper class of Pennsylvania. They were holding goblets, sipping red wine, and whispering about the situation on Wall Street. Not far away were mostly Chris's family and friends. They seemed to be much more lively, gathering together to gossip. Like most American girls, Chris didn't like noise, so the banquet was quite moderate. There was no loud noise, and there was no harsh rock music. Even if they spoke, most people consciously lowered their voices. Therefore, when Chris rushed in, the sound of the door was particularly ear-piercing, and everyone's eyes turned to her. Being stared at by everyone, Chris felt a chill run down her spine. She wanted to shout that there was a devil behind her and call the police. But she also knew that if she shouted, there would only be two results: either Su Ling would catch up and kill her, or Su Ling would retreat, and she would be regarded as a lunatic and sent to a mental hospital. Chris quickly calmed down, pulled the hair hanging down from her ear, and reluctantly smiled at the crowd as a greeting. Everyone also raised their glasses to Chris, then turned their heads and went to talk about their own things. Chris resisted the urge to run as far away as she could and squeezed herself into the crowd. This kind of situation was a bit like using ordinary people who didn't know anything as a meat shield. It was very unkind, but there was no other way. Hiding in the crowd, Chris looked nervously and carefully at the door. From time to time, her eyes looked around, looking for a convenient way to escape. While she was looking around, she suddenly saw a person rush in. It was Han Zhen, who had followed her. Chris's face changed, and her body involuntarily shrank back. But at that moment, a voice came from the side. "Hey, Chris, so you're here." Chris looked back and saw that it was her brother-in-law. Before she could greet him, she saw that Han Zhen had already heard her shout and was looking at her like an eagle. Chris was shocked, but she didn't dare to show too much of an abnormality. She could only reluctantly greet her brother-in-law. "Hi, Charlotte." Charlotte didn't wait for her to finish. She grabbed her and asked anxiously, "Hey, Chris, I have something to ask you. Let's go to the side, okay?" Chris groaned inwardly, but just as she was about to refuse, Charlotte pulled her towards a spacious balcony in the backyard. Just as Chris was about to struggle, she saw Han Zhen walking quickly towards her. She gritted her teeth, nodded to Charlotte, pointed to the backyard, and said, "Let's talk there." Charlotte was overjoyed. He let go of Chris's hand and walked through the courtyard with her to the backyard. As soon as they got rid of the guests everywhere, Charlotte rubbed his hands and asked eagerly, "Chris, didn't the King friends who came with you last time come? You know, I also like national culture. Can I have a chance to get to know them?" Chris cursed in her heart. She glanced at Charlotte with a faint smile, as if saying, "Aren't you afraid that my sister will find out?" Charlotte also understood her gaze and quickly explained, "Don't get me wrong. I just want to get to know a few national friends, nothing else." Before he could finish, Han Zhen had already come over and said with a smile, "Chris, there you are. I was looking for you just now." Chris stared at him unkindly and said with a faint smile, "Han Zhen, I didn't expect you to be so concerned about me." Chris's words were full of resentment and had a double meaning, but Han Zhen didn't seem to hear it. He still smiled and reached out to grab Chris's shoulder. He smiled proudly and said, "Chris, I've always been concerned about you. Haven't you noticed?" When Chris saw him grabbing her, she struggled with her shoulder and angrily pushed him away. Her body was created by the spirit pill, so she was very strong. This push immediately sent Han Zhen flying. He fell into the grass in the back garden and fell on his face. Charlotte, who was standing to the side, was dumbfounded. He looked at his sister-in-law as if she was an alien. He couldn't imagine that Chris could push Han Zhen, an adult man weighing 150 kilograms, several meters away with a single push. After Chris pushed Han Zhen away, she realized that something was wrong. Her brother-in-law was still standing next to her. She turned her head to look at Charlotte, her eyes flickering. Charlotte was so scared that he quickly raised his hands and said, "Chris, just pretend that I didn't say anything just now." Before Chris could speak, she felt a strong wind coming from beside her, and Su Chan's cry of surprise came into her ears. "Chris, why are you here? Go in." As soon as this cry of surprise rang out, Su Chan fell from mid-air with a cry. Just as she was about to fall to the ground, she flipped her body in mid-air, and her falling body immediately became as light as a feather. Like a nimble fox, she floated to the ground. As soon as Su Chan landed, she grabbed Chris's arm and wanted to rush into the room. However, as soon as she moved, she saw Zi Yuan appear in front of them in an instant, and Su Ling also chased after them like a maggot attached to a bone. Su Ling stood on the roof and looked down at the three women in the yard. He laughed proudly and said, "You still want to run? Do you think that running to a place with so many people is enough?" As he spoke, Su Ling took out a jade seal from his sleeve. He held it high and stamped it in the air in front of him. Immediately, 2 black characters were clearly stamped in the air. They were the 2 characters of 5 ghosts in ancient seal script. When Su Chan and Zi Yuan had fought on Tiandu Peak, they had never seen Su Ling use such a vicious, powerful magical weapon as the 5 ghosts and 5 plagues. Zi Yuan was experienced and knowledgeable. When she saw the words, 5 ghosts, she was shocked and cried out involuntarily, 5 ghosts and 5 plagues? How could you have such a vicious magical weapon? Su Ling grinned grimly. The 2 black characters, 5 ghosts, in front of him hung in the air for a while, then slowly twisted and drifted away, as if the condensed thick ink had been dispersed by someone with an inking stone. The black chi slowly dissipated into 5 human figures. These 5 people were dressed in 5 colored robes, each holding an object. One was holding a frame and a jar, one was holding a leather bag and a sword, one was holding a fan, one was holding a hammer, and one was holding a fire kettle. The 5 of them had blue faces and empty eyes, and their bodies were emitting a black aura of death. They were the 5 plague ghosts, who were known as the 5 ghosts in the sky and the 5 plagues on the ground: Zhang Yuanbua, the spring plague; Lu Yuanda, the summer plague; Zhao Gongming, the winter plague; Zhong Rengui, and Shi Yi, the chief plague. Zi Yuan naturally knew how powerful the 5 plague ghosts were. She was so shocked that her face turned pale. Without thinking about it, she immediately pulled Su Chan and shouted, "Let's go." Although Su Chan didn't know what kind of powerful magical weapon it was, she felt her hair stand on end just by smelling the pungent stench. She and Zi Yuan were next to Chris, one on the left and the other on the right. With a shout, the 3 of them flew out in an instant, turning into a beam of blue light and fleeing into the distance. Su Ling grinned hideously. "Where are you going?" The 5 ghosts and 5 plagues in front of him immediately chased after them like shadows. He and Su, who had rushed over later, also turned into 2 beams of blue light and followed them. Charlot was dumbfounded for a while, as if he had been immobilized. It wasn't until his wife called out to him from the house that he came to his senses. Kurt looked at her husband, who was standing in the yard, in surprise. She asked in confusion, "Honey, what happened?" The corner of Charlot's eyes twitched. "Honey, come out and look at them." Zi Yuan and Su Chan quickly fled with Chris, but Chris was full of doubts. She had seen the powerful magical weapon used by Su Ling transform into 5 people, but she didn't understand why Zi Yuan and Su Chan wanted to take her away from here. Although she hadn't learned any magic from Li Yundong, she still knew some basic rules of the cultivation world. Chris knew that cultivators couldn't use magic on ordinary people, kill them with Xinqi, or use powerful magical weapons to kill ordinary people. Therefore, when Su Chan asked her to run to a crowded place, she ran home without thinking. At this time, she was flying in the air, and the strong wind was blowing against her face, making her almost unable to open her eyes. She struggled and shouted, "Why are you running away? Isn't he afraid of being discovered when he uses magic?" As soon as she opened her mouth, the strong wind poured into her mouth, almost choking her. Zi Yuan had Jinshin to protect her body, so she was naturally not afraid of the strong wind. She said loudly, "That's the 5 ghosts and 5 plagues. This powerful magical weapon represents the power of nature in the heaven realm. It's the exclusive powerful magical weapon of the 5 ghosts and 5 plagues. Anyone who dies from being contaminated by the plague will be automatically judged by heaven to have died of the plague, not killed by magic." Hearing this, Chris was shocked. "You mean that if this guy used magic in my house, everyone in my family would die, and he wouldn't be punished by heaven's tribulation?" Zi Yuan said loudly, "That's exactly what I mean." Su Chan, who was standing to one side, blamed herself with a face full of chagrin. "It's all my fault. I thought it would be safe in a crowded place. I didn't know that this guy had such an abnormal powerful magical weapon. I almost caused a big disaster." At this time, she looked back and saw that Su Ling and Su Kong had caught up with them. Su Chan's expression changed, and she shouted in surprise and joy, "Sister Ziyuan, they're catching up. What should we do?" Ziyuan looked back and saw that Su Ling, Su Kong, and the 5 ghosts and 5 plagues were all following behind them like ghosts. Although she was nervous and afraid, at least they wouldn't harm mortals, so she was a little relieved. She said, "I don't have any good ideas. I can only try my best to get rid of them. Why don't we split up and run?" Su Chan immediately knew that Ziyuan wanted to sacrifice herself to buy time for them to escape, so she said decisively, "No, Chris can't fly. If we run separately, we will definitely be caught by them separately. Sister Ziyuan, I've learned a magic in the past few days. Maybe it can trap them. Can you help me buy some time to hold them back so I can use this magic?" Ziyuan was stunned. What kind of magic? Su Chan bit her lip and said word by word, "This is the secret technique of our Fox Zen school, the prison of the earth." Chapter 764. Circle of Imprisonment. Hearing the name of this magic, Ziyuan was stunned, but she quickly asked, "Could it be the illusion magic circle that trapped me and Li Yundong in Penglai Pavilion?" Although she didn't have much hope in her heart, Ziyuan still blurted out this sentence. Ziyuan knew many magic arts, and she was even more proficient in magic circles. Li Yundong was also one of the best cultivators in the world. An illusion maze that could trap the two of them at the same time was naturally not a trivial matter. If Su Chan knew such magic, it would be a pleasant surprise. Facing Ziyuan's expectant and hopeful eyes, Su Chan hesitated for a moment and said, "It's indeed this magic, but I can't leave when I use it. I have to maintain this magic all the time, and someone has to protect me." Although Su Chan's current cultivation was lower than Ao Wushuang's, it was not much worse. Moreover, Ao Wushuang had taught Su Chan many magic arts in the past, but because her spiritual power was weak before, she couldn't use them, and she didn't pay much attention to them, so she had almost forgotten many of the magic arts she had taught her. But after Ao Wushuang left, Su Chan thought about it and read the classics left by her master. She focused on practicing a few magic arts that she thought were more important. Now it came in handy. When Ziyuan heard this, she was overjoyed and quickly said, "How long do you want me to hold them back?" Su Chan thought for a moment and said, 1 minute. A minute didn't seem long, but for cultivators, it was enough for them to die more than a dozen times. Especially now that Ziyuan's powerful magical weapon had been exchanged by Yu Huang Xiandu, she could be said to be barehanded. If she wanted to hold back a Jinshin master like Su Ling, and there was also a Yang spirit master like Su Kong next to her, the difficulty and danger of the situation could be imagined. Ziyuan thought for a moment and asked, "How long can you hold on?" Su Chan thought again and said, 48 hours at most. Ziyuan immediately said decisively, "Okay. I'll hold them back. You cast the magic as soon as possible." Then she said to Chris, "We'll trap the two of them later. You have to go back to Li Yundong as soon as possible and tell him the situation here. Let him come to support us as soon as possible." Chris was shocked and immediately said, "No, how can I leave you at this time? Ziyuan, your cultivation is high. You should inform master." Ziyuan said angrily, "Nonsense. If I leave, you will hold Su Ling and Su Kong back. If we can't hold them back, Su Chan will die. If we continue to fight with them like this, we will also die. If you leave quickly, there may be a chance to survive." Chris gritted her teeth as she struggled internally. She also knew that this was the best solution. Although she was unwilling, she could only grit her teeth and nod in agreement. As soon as the three landed, Chi, Su Kong, and Chi, God, and Chi. As, Chi and Chi, Li, Chi, of Chi, Li, and Li. As, Chi, Ziyuan Chi, Yen, Su, Lin, Ling Chi, Yen, Su, Chi, Ti. As, the three, as, Qi, Yang, Qi, Su, Qi, Li, let's see if you can run to the ends of the earth. The battle at Tiandu Peak had been regarded as a great shame by Su Ling. He thought that if it hadn't been for Li Yundong and the others, he would have definitely gotten the 3D Yuan Jin Dan and the Medicine King tripod by himself. At that time, he would have found a place to cultivate quietly for 8 or 10 years. When he came out of the mountain, he would have been able to do whatever he wanted in the cultivation world. However, Li Yundong and the others had joined forces to shatter his dream, and then he had been defeated in Southeast Asia. Now that he had recovered from his injuries in the United States, he suddenly saw Zi Yuan and the others. Naturally, he wanted to pull out his tendons and peel off his bones. He chased after them and wanted to wash away his shame. Zi Yuan winked at Chris, who was beside her, indicating for her to run quickly. She stood in front of her and said with a cold face, "Taoist priest Su Ling, there is no hatred in the world that can't be solved. Why do you have to force us?" Su Ling grinned grimly and said, "Force us? Humph, when we were on Tiandu Peak, you didn't know what was good for you. Today, you actually ran into my hands. What else do you have to say? If you know what's good for you, kneel down and lick my toes obediently. Otherwise, I will destroy your body and soul and make your whole life's cultivation go to waste." Zi Yuan was furious, but her face remained calm. She put her hand in her sleeve and pinched a talisman. Her lips moved slightly as she recited a spell. Not long after she recited, there was a loud explosion in the sky, and the wind and clouds surged. Soon, dark clouds covered the top of their heads, and the wind and clouds were dense. Su Ling's face changed and he said angrily, "I've given you face, but you don't want it. How dare you play with heavenly thunder in front of me? You're courting death." He pointed his finger, and then the 5 ghosts and 5 plagues roared and turned into several different colors of demonic wind, rushing towards Zi Yuan. Zi Yuan's face changed and she shouted, "Chris, run! Su Chan, run!" Without saying a word, Chris jumped up and ran into the distance. Su Chan jumped up and quickly circled around Su Ling and Su Ling. As Su Chan spun, she pinched the fingers of the Buddhist incantation of 9 words and silently recited the supreme mantra of Taoism, Lin. Bing. Do. Swordsman. Jia. Zhen. Lai. Qian. Yes. This secret mantra was created by Zhang Daoling, the founder of Taoism. It was first recorded in Guhang's Biyao, the 4th chapter of the Taoist Cultivation Master. It was also known as Liujia's Secret Chu. It belonged to the Taoist forbidden mantra and was extremely powerful. The Buddhist incantation of 9 words was a secret that could not be passed down, but there was no such thing as an impenetrable wall in the world. After the Buddhist incantation of 9 words was spread out, it formed several versions. One was the secret version, one was the Taoist version, and the other was the very influential version of the Japanese Shingon Tantrism. The power of these versions was different, but later, the mystical silver fox of the Fox Zen school stole it and carried it out and transformed it. As the leader of the 4th generation of the Fox Zen school, the mystical silver fox also knew that it was extremely rare for her to be able to cultivate a shentong that was both hard and soft. Most of the other disciples were ordinary fox demons, and most of them were fox demons. How could they use such a fierce mantra? Therefore, she specially modified this magic according to the characteristics of the cultivators of the Fox Zen school, changing this fierce kung fu into a strange and unpredictable illusion maze. The Buddhist incantation of 9 words had different names in each school. In the Xinyan Tantrism, the Buddhist incantation of 9 words was the Lin Bing Do Zhe Rei. In the sects of the Fox Zen school and the Hua Taoist family, the 9 words was the Lin Bing Do Zhe Rei. The power of these 9 words was different. Every time Su Chan silently shouted a word, her hands quickly pinched a finger gesture, and her feet stepped on the Tiangang and the earthly evil, which was in line with the 7 stars technique. She pointed to the 9 heavens' divine night. Soon, a white mist visible to the naked eye spread out from her body, quickly covering the surroundings. Su Chan's cultivation was far inferior to that of Lu Ye's. Naturally, it was impossible for her to use this magic formation as easily as Lu Yi. Not only could she let the other party enter the formation without noticing, but she could also trap the opponent in it and make it difficult for him to escape without any maintenance. As soon as Su Chan used the prison of painting, Su Ling was immediately alerted. He shouted angrily in shock and anger, his roar shaking the sky. "How dare a little fox demon show off in front of me? You're courting death." After that, he turned into a golden light and rushed towards Su Chan. At this time, Zi Yuan suddenly shouted and pointed her finger at the sky. With a click, a bolt of lightning fell and accurately struck towards Su Ling. Zi Yuan was a virgin, so naturally, it was impossible for her to control the heavenly thunder. She could only control the lightning. However, the power of the lightning was not trivial. Su Ling immediately dodged and did not dare to get close to her. At the same time, she drove the Tiangang wind to blow in all directions, and the plague that was close to her couldn't get close to her. For a moment, the plague was lingering around, and the grass on the outskirts of Harrisburg suddenly became dirty and black, like hell. At this time, Su Ling attacked Su Chan together, and Zi Yuan intercepted him. Although Su Ling could stop Su Chan's figure was extremely fast, and he couldn't catch her at all. Every time he saw that he could hit her, he often hit an illusion. Although Su Ling and Su Ling saw that Chris had escaped, they didn't take it seriously. They thought that Chris wouldn't be able to cause any trouble in this unfamiliar place. Chris ran for a long distance before she dared to look back. With the help of the moonlight, she saw a white mist shrouding the figures of several people behind her. Waves of angry roars rang out continuously. Bolts of lightning struck down from the sky one after another, and the ground was covered in black dirty water, spreading in all directions like ghosts. Chris shivered all over and didn't dare to stay. She immediately took a big turn, identified the direction of the sky, and ran in the direction of her home. At this time, they had probably flown dozens of miles away. Chris's physical strength was extremely tyrannical. At this time, she spread her legs and ran wildly. Her legs crossed like a pair of scissors, constantly opening and closing, stomping on the ground like a galloping horse. Chris was burning with anxiety, and her physical strength and potential were boiling to the extreme. Although she was a little out of breath at first, the more she ran, the more her chi and blood surged in her body, and the smoother her breathing became. White and black people were originally strong in chi and blood, and their muscles and bones were strong. This was a unique advantage of the human race. In terms of martial arts, many white people, especially black people, were born with tendons that took Easterners 10 years to train. Chris had the advantages of both the East and the West. Not only was her chi and blood strong, her muscles and bones strong, but her skin was delicate and her pores were quite fine. At this time, when she ran, her chi and blood surged, like a pot of boiling water in a cauldron, and steam constantly came out of her pores. Fortunately, her pores were delicate, and she didn't sweat too much. Otherwise, with the characteristics of ordinary Westerners with thick pores, just exhaling and sweating would cause more than half of her primordial chi to run out. The reason why Westerners had an innate advantage in cultivation was that they were born with sufficient chi and blood. Sufficient chi and blood meant sufficient jinqi in their bodies. However, this was also their innate disadvantage. It was precisely because they were born with too much chi and blood that the heat in their bodies was rolling, and they had to have thick pores to expel the heat. Therefore, once they exercised, they would be drenched in sweat and their primordial chi would be greatly depleted. However, Westerners did not understand the principle of, the way of man is to reduce the insufficiency and provide for the surplus. They did not know how to take care of their body or cultivate. In their later years, strong martial artists or athletes would either have Parkinson's disease, dementia, or be half disabled. Therefore, Westerners could get started quickly, but it was difficult for them to reach the top. Because they practiced fast, it was also fast. Chris ran all the way with only one thought in her mind, immediately returned to her master's side and asked for help. At this time, her mind was the same, without any distractions. Instead, it coincided with the highest realm of cultivation. Therefore, not only did the qi and blood in her body not weaken at all, but it became more and more vigorous, and her spirit became stronger and stronger. It was a pity that she did not know how to consciously open and close her pores and acupoints like Li Yundong when he was cultivating in Tibet. Otherwise, she would have been able to gain something just by running for this distance. Chris ran for dozens of miles at the speed of a 100-meter sprint and finally ran back to her home. At this time, the family banquet was still going on. Everyone at the banquet saw Chris rush in covered in sweat and rush straight to her bedroom. After a while, she rushed out like a gust of wind. She did not say hello to anyone on the way, only leaving them stunned. After Chris rushed out of the house, she immediately drove her car to the airport. As soon as she arrived at the airport, she did not even have time to close the car door and rushed to the airport building. After buying the ticket for the first flight to Shanghai, Chris calmed down a little. At this time, Chris anxiously looked at the electronic sign in the waiting building. Watching the time pass by, she suddenly hated herself for not knowing how to cultivate as much as she did now. If only I could fly. If only I could fight. Chris bit her lip tightly and clenched her fists unconsciously. 48 hours. It seemed very long, but it would take more than 10 hours to fly there by plane, and it would take nearly a day to reach Tiannan City. Could she really make it in time? Have Su Chan and Zi Yuan really trapped Su Ling and Su Kong? Chapter 765. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation Crazy was anxiously calling Li Yundong. Because it was a banquet that night, Chris was wearing a long dress similar to an evening gown. Except for the deep cleavage of her breasts, there was no place for her to put her phone. She was born into a superior family and had an excellent upbringing, so naturally, it was impossible for her to do such a thing as stuffing her phone into her cleavage. Zi Yuan and Su Chan were two cultivators through and through. One was a communication tool that never used any electronic means, and the other had been given to her by Zhou Qin before, but it was later confiscated by her master. She had borrowed it from Liu Bei and never returned it. Chris ran all the way home, took her handbag, and ran to the airport. Although they hadn't known each other for a long time, Chris knew that Li Yundong was a typical person who used his mobile phone as a landline and a pager. Asking him to answer a phone call was really a great karma boost. It was like winning the lottery. Chris was afraid that she would be delayed if she couldn't get through to him at home, so she made two preparations. While running to the airport, she desperately called Li Yundong after safely arriving at the airport. "Master, pick up the phone, pick up the phone." Chris stamped her feet anxiously, but the voice on the phone did not disappoint her. "I'm sorry, the number you have dialed is currently unavailable." "I'm sorry, you." Chris was as anxious as an ant on a hot pot. She wished she could immediately grow wings and fly back to Tiannan City. After dialing Li Yundong's phone number for a while, she quickly searched for Zhou Qin's phone number on her mobile phone. She was overjoyed to find Zhou Qin's phone number on her mobile phone, but after dialing for a long time, no one answered, just like Li Yundong's mobile phone. This time, Chris was so anxious that she broke out in a cold sweat. She quickly sent a few identical text messages to Li Yundong and Zhou Qin, telling them about Su Chan and Zi Yuan's situation, and saying that she had rushed home as fast as she could. After sending the text message, Chris waited in the airport lobby for the news of the plane's departure. She finally boarded the plane, but it was another 10-hour journey. In the past, flying from the distant Pacific Ocean to China for more than 10 hours was nothing more than a night's sleep. But in this situation, how could Chris fall asleep? She tossed and turned in her seat, her heart full of worry for the safety of Su Chan and Zi Yuan. After an unknown amount of time, Chris finally fell asleep from worry and exhaustion. When she woke up, it was already the afternoon of the next day. After Chris got off the plane, she went straight to the train station and rushed back to Tiannan City as fast as she could. When Chris rushed to Li Yundong's house, it was already very dark. It had been a whole day since she left Harrisburg. Chris came out of the train station and quickly grabbed a taxi. Before the car stopped, she took out a handful of money from her wallet, threw it on the seat, and got out of the car as fast as lightning. As soon as she got out of the car, she shouted, "Master, master." But after shouting for a while, she felt that something was wrong. She immediately shouted, "Li Yundong, Li Yundong." Sure enough, someone poked her head out from the balcony. It was Ling Yu of the Fox Zen School. At this time, the Sanxian had already closed, and the little foxes who were helping out in the shop had already returned home. Hearing someone calling for Li Yundong outside, and the voice was quite familiar, Ling Yu poked her head out and said, "Who is it? Why are you so noisy? Can't you keep it down?" She saw Chris at a glance and immediately asked curiously, "Chris? It's you? I didn't see you last night. Where did you go?" Chris had left in a hurry, and at that time, only Zi Yuan, Su Chan, and Zhou Qin knew. Ling Yu and the others didn't know where Chris, Zi Yuan, and the others had gone. Chris was stunned and thought to herself, "Didn't Master tell them where we went?" Li Yundong knew that there were still outsiders in the Fox Zen School, so he hadn't told them many things. Chris suddenly had doubts in her heart, but she didn't have time to think about it. She asked loudly downstairs, "Is Master here?" Ling Yu pointed to the room inside and made a trumpet gesture with her hand. She lowered her voice and said, "Yes, he's in seclusion. Don't disturb him." Chris immediately rushed home. As soon as she entered the door, she rushed to Li Yundong's room in a hurry. She said anxiously, "Hurry up, wake Master up. It's urgent, it's really urgent." Ling Yu gestured for her to keep quiet. "Keep your voice down. Didn't you see that we even went to the opposite side to watch TV?" Chris looked around and saw that the living room was empty. It was not as lively as it used to be. She grabbed Ling Yu and said, "Zi Yuan and Su Chan are in danger now. If we don't wake Master up, I'm afraid he won't be able to see them when he comes out of seclusion." Ling Yu was shocked. "What's going on?" Chris grabbed Ling Yu and rushed to Li Yundong's room. "Let's wake Master up first. There's no time." Ling Yu had never seen Chris so anxious before. She didn't dare to be careless and quickly walked to Li Yundong's room. She stretched out her hand and was about to knock on the door when she saw the closed door creak open. Li Yundong walked out and looked at them with a smile. "What happened?" he asked. "Why is it so noisy?" Ling Yu and Chris were overjoyed. Ling Yu blurted out, "Leader, you've come out of seclusion? What a coincidence." Li Yundong smiled slightly. "I was just meditating. In a daze, I heard a lot of voices outside, so I woke up." "What happened?" When Li Yundong was in seclusion, everyone in the Fox Zen School would consciously create a relatively quiet environment for him. When watching TV, they would run to the opposite door, and they would avoid laughing and playing as much as possible. Therefore, Li Yundong also knew that there was a sudden loud voice outside. It was very likely that something had gone wrong, so he quickly woke up from a relatively shallow meditative state. Chris grabbed Li Yundong's hand and said quickly, "Master, something has happened. Su Chan and Zi Yuan, something has happened to them." Su Chan was Li Yundong's Achilles heel, and Zi Yuan was also Li Yundong's Achilles heel that couldn't be touched. When he heard this, his face suddenly changed, and his smiling face suddenly turned livid. "What's wrong? Don't worry, tell me slowly." Chris was very eloquent. She quickly told him what had happened. After that, she complained bitterly, "Master, why don't you use your mobile phone? If I could inform you by phone, you would have saved them by now." Li Yundong's face was cold, but he didn't say anything. Instead, Ling Yu, who was beside him, said, "Chris, you don't know that when cultivators are meditating, they can't suddenly have a sound next to them. When you came back, Leader was in meditation, so it didn't affect him. Otherwise, if it had affected him, it would have been a terrible thing." Only then did Chris understand. No wonder no one had answered Li Yundong's call. It turned out that he was meditating in seclusion, but why was it such a coincidence that he was meditating at this time? Li Yundong was also secretly angry about this. After reading the secret method of heaven patching, he was naturally eager to learn it, so he went into seclusion to practice. However, he hadn't expected that such a big thing would happen during this seclusion. Seeing his ugly expression, Chris was afraid that he would blame himself, so she said, "Master, why didn't anyone answer Zhou Qin's phone? Is she also meditating in seclusion?" Li Yundong glanced at Zhou Qin's room and nodded. "Yes, she is meditating in seclusion. Don't disturb her, or she will be possessed by the devil. Let's go now and fly over. We can make it in time." Chris's expression changed and she said, "Master, I don't have to go anymore. I can't fly." Li Yundong said flatly, "No, if you don't go, how can I know the general direction? I'll take you flying." Chris hesitated for a moment and stammered, "But, Master, if you take me all the way there, won't you be too tired?" Li Yundong's cultivation had reached the top phase of the Jinshan, and he had cultivated the golden jade body, which cultivated both internal and external cultivation. It could be said that his kung fu was superb. He could sense heaven and earth, and with a single thought, the heaven and earth would move. However, the power of heaven and earth was endless, which did not mean that Li Yundong also had endless power. The unity of heaven and man was just using his own small universe as a medium and a foothold to resonate with the universe, thereby absorbing and receiving the power in it. It was just like Archimedes had said, "Lend me a fulcrum, and I can pry up the whole earth." No matter how good Li Yundong's fulcrum was, he still had to use strength. With the power of Jinshan, he and Chris flew from Tiannan City to Harrisburg in the United States. Even if Li Yundong could persist for more than 10 hours, he would be so tired that he would vomit blood. If he fought a strong enemy with fatigue, it would be like going to the toilet with a lantern, looking for *T, death. When Li Yundong heard Chris's concerns, he snorted coldly and said, "I have a way. Just listen to me." Chris gritted her teeth and said, "Master, what do you want me to do? Tell me." Li Yundong's eyes narrowed as he stared at Chris and said, "Take a deep breath, sink your qi into your dantian, and keep your mind focused." Although Chris had never learned cultivation seriously, she still knew how to sink her qi into her dantian and keep her mind focused. She immediately concentrated and took a deep breath. As soon as she calmed her qi and calmed her mind, she saw Li Yundong suddenly turn his left hand and slap it toward the top of her head. His other right hand made a lotus fist, with his index finger erected and the upper knuckle slightly curved like a hook. It was the Buddha top Mahamudra of the womb concealment, removing obstacles. His upright and slightly curved index finger quickly went toward the Shinting acupoint on Chris's face. Chris saw that Li Yundong had attacked her without warning, and every move was aimed at her vital point. She couldn't help but be so shocked that her beautiful face turned pale. She suddenly thought in her heart, "Master, don't tell me that you hate me for getting Su Chan and Zi Yuan into trouble and want to kill me?" Chapter 766. As soon as this frightening thought flashed through her mind, she subconsciously closed her eyes. Li Yundong's palm had already slapped the top of her head, and the index finger of his right hand was also chiseled into the Shinting acupoint on her forehead. At that moment, Chris felt her body tremble as a majestic force poured into her from the top of her head like a flood. This power was as hot as lava, dripping down from the top of her head as if she had been enlightened. It quickly poured into her limbs, hair, and then gathered in her internal organs. At this time, Li Yundong's right hand pinched the Mahamudra of eliminating obstacles on the top of the Buddha, and his fingers dug into her forehead. Suddenly, it seemed as if a hole had been dug into the top of her head, and the heat in her internal organs began to boil. Chris only felt that her internal organs were like a boiling boiler, and the heat was constantly burning and rolling in her chest and abdomen. This heat was like a whirlpool gathering in the lower dantian of her lower abdomen, gathering more and more, like a constantly burning fireball. The heat from this fireball was constantly rushing up and out of her shunting acupoint. Although Chris could clearly feel the abnormality in her body, it didn't make her feel any pain. It was as if she was in a sauna. Amidst the slight stab of pain, there was a feeling of contentment and contentment. Chris only felt that her body was becoming lighter and lighter, as if her whole body was about to float. Before long, she opened her eyes and was shocked. She saw that she was floating in the air, and there was a blonde woman with blue eyes standing at her feet with her eyes closed. It was her body. Chris's eyes widened and she looked at her body in mid-air in disbelief. She stammered, am I dead? Ling Yu, who was standing to one side, burst out laughing. She looked at Chris with some envy and said, don't be silly. Now your Yin spirit is out of your body. She pouted, and the corners of her eyes were a little unhappy. She thought to herself, leader is so biased. Why didn't he help me? Chris didn't know what was happening in front of her, but Ling Yu knew it very well. Although Chris's body was reconstructed by a panacea, she had yet to reach the foundation establishment realm, nor had she formally cultivated. Thus, it was naturally impossible for her to have a Yin spirit, and it was naturally impossible for her Yin spirit to leave her body. However, at this time, Li Yundong was temporarily helping Chris condense the Niden in her lower abdomen. Then, through the Niden in her lower abdomen, he forcefully pulled her Yin spirit out of her body. Flying with the Yang spirit or the Yin spirit consumed much less Jinqi than flying with the body. Chris flew with Li Yundong in the body of the Yin spirit. She didn't need to consume any Jinqi, and she wouldn't be a burden to Li Yundong. Naturally, there wouldn't be the embarrassing situation of being knocked to the ground by the other party after running for thousands of miles. Although this method was a bit like spoiling things through excessive enthusiasm and was extremely risky, it was a last resort right now. Moreover, Chris would definitely benefit greatly in the future. Chris looked down at herself, her face full of shock and confusion. My Yin spirit has left my body? Does it mean his soul left his body? Li Yundong nodded at her. Something like that. Come on, let's talk on the way. After that, he also instantly left his body with the Yang spirit. With the 7 treasure purse that he carried with him, he grabbed Chris's Yin spirit and flew out. Although the Yin spirit was invisible and intangible, when Li Yundong grabbed Chris's wrist, it was as if he had grabbed it. Chris saw a layer of faint golden light flowing on her wrist. She was effortlessly pulled by Li Yundong to fly at a high speed, but she could no longer feel the strong wind blowing in her ears. Chris felt like she was hanging in a small carriage behind a high-speed train. She didn't need to expend any energy to be carried by Li Yundong at a high speed. Out of curiosity, she reached out her hand to touch the place on her wrist where the golden light was flowing, only to find that the place she touched felt solid. When she touched other parts of her body, she suddenly felt empty air, as if she was just a cloud of mist. Chris couldn't help but say in surprise, "It's amazing. Can the soul really go out of the body?" As Li Yundong flew with her, he explained to her, the soul is just a general term. The Yang spirit and the Yin spirit can all be called souls. Before anyone cultivates, if there is a situation where the soul goes out of the body, it will be the Yin spirit without exception. It is invisible and intangible, and it can't touch anything. But if you know how to cultivate, build the Zhuji phase, and cultivate the Yang spirit, it means that you have transcended this body that will die of old age. From then on, you will have one more life than ordinary people. As long as your Yang spirit is not destroyed, you will never die. Chris's eyes widened when she heard this. She listened to every word Li Yundong said eagerly. After he finished, she asked again, "But I heard that if the soul is out of the body for too long, will something happen?" Li Yundong nodded at her and motioned for her to be at ease. He said, "If you rely on your current strength to get out of your body, if you leave your body for too long or too far, your soul will lose connection with your body. Even if your soul returns in the future, your body will have decayed. You told me before that your grandmother was affected by the soul detachment technique. Your grandma still left a part of her soul in her body. Her 3 spiritual and 7 physical souls haven't left her body. The part she left is in charge of the body's metabolism, so that when your soul comes back one day, you won't find that your body is no longer usable. Hearing this, Chris felt a little relieved, but she still asked with some worry, but I haven't built the Zhuji phase yet. Will it be okay for my Yin spirit to leave so far away? Chris's worry was reasonable. At this time, Li Yundong smiled slightly and said lightly, don't worry, as long as I am here, as long as you are not 3 meters away from me, you can go anywhere in the world. There was a well-known saying in the cultivation world, which was, solitary Yin does not grow, and solitary Yang does not grow. Although this sentence came from Cheng Yunqing's Zhonglin, a writer of the Qing dynasty, this truth had long been recorded in many cultivation books. If Chris's Yin spirit left her body without Li Yundong's help, she would not be able to hold on even if she flew dozens of miles, let alone tens of thousands of miles. Her Yin spirit would even break on the spot, and she would not be able to control her soul and be torn apart. This was the truth that solitary Yin did not grow. At this time, with the help of Li Yundong's powerful Yuanyang genuine qi, her Yin spirit condensed within 3 meters of Li Yundong. She did not have to worry about it collapsing because of her low cultivation. Although Li Yundong's words sounded calm, Chris still sensed an extremely confident and conceited arrogance in his tone, as if he was looking down on the world and no one could compete with him. A confident man could exude a strange aura. Chris felt a strong sense of security from Li Yundong's words. She immediately felt completely relieved and did not say anything more. The two of them flew all the way. The speed of the Yang spirit was far faster than that of the physical body. A few hours later, they had already flown to the other side of the Pacific Ocean. At this time, it was already 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, when the sky was darkest. Chris looked up at the stars in the sky. After identifying the direction, she pointed with her finger and Li Yundong flew over with her. Seeing that there were more and more buildings around them, Li Yundong landed with Chris. At this time, they had already entered the suburbs on the edge of Harrisburg. At this time, Chris looked around, pondered for a moment, and said, "Find my house first, and then I'll know how to go." Li Yundong nodded and quickly flew to her home in the direction Chris had pointed out. At this time, the banquet at Chris's home had already ended. Although she had left without saying goodbye, the guests still had a good time. Many people were sleeping in the living room. Chris only glanced at her home before turning her gaze elsewhere, searching for the path she had taken to get here. She quickly pointed and said, "It's here." Li Yundong nodded and once again flew quickly with her. The two of them flew for a long time, but they did not see a single figure. Chris couldn't help but feel anxious. Why didn't I see them? Could it be that they were no longer here? Harrisburg, as the capital of a state, had less than 50,000 people. Compared with the provincial capitals of China, it was incredible. One could imagine how sparsely populated it was. Especially in the suburbs, it was normal to walk for more than 10 miles without seeing a single person. At this time, it was late at night, and it was difficult to see clearly. Even if she took a wrong step at the beginning, she would be wrong for more than 10 miles. What's more, she didn't know whether Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and the others had left or where they were. The more Chris thought about it, the more flustered she became, and for a moment, her face became extremely ugly. Li Yundong was angry at first, but at this time, he calmed down. He simply pulled Chris to stand in the wilderness and said, "Don't worry, I'll look around." As he said this, he closed his eyes, and in an instant, his body rose into the air, turning into countless golden lights and scattering in all directions. It was one of the 8 great magical powers of the 8 great freedoms of the Buddhist Dharma, which could allow thousands of incarnations. When Chris saw that the golden light was as dazzling as fireworks, she was stunned and speechless. She stayed where she was and didn't dare to move, for fear that Li Yundong would never return and she would become a lonely ghost. Eventually, her soul would dissipate between heaven and earth. Fortunately, Li Yundong had only left for a few seconds before the golden light gathered back. Li Yundong's figure appeared, took Chris's hand, and flew in the east direction. "Let's go, I found it." Chris was pulled by him and flew about 2 or 3 miles away. Suddenly, she saw a fog in front of her, covering the surrounding wasteland with a radius of hundreds of meters. A bright moon as big as a silver plate was hanging high in the sky. This fog seemed to separate the outside world from the inside, making people feel like they were separated by yin and yang. It was extremely strange. At this time, Li Yundong's face was as cold as water. He turned to Chris and said, "Stand 3 meters behind me. No matter what happens, don't move. Do you understand?" Chris knew that an earth-shattering battle was about to break out. How could she dare to say no? She quickly nodded like a chicken pecking rice. Li Yundong was relieved and turned his head to look at the fog. He smiled coldly and thought to himself, Su Ling, I almost died in your hands in the Battle of Carry Holy Mountain, and I almost died in your hands in Tiandu Peak. Now, the tables have turned. It's okay if you provoke me, but how dare you bully Su Chan and Zi Yuan? While Li Yundong was thinking about it, his heart skipped a beat. He remembered that Chris had once told him that Su Chan had used an illusion maze to trap Su Ling and Su Kong in it. At this time, they must not have broken out. Why not make good preparations before they break out? Thinking of this, Li Yundong sneered and whispered sarcastically, "If I don't entertain you warmly, how can I be worthy of our meeting?" Chapter 767. Chris opened her blue eyes and looked at the thick white fog in front of her in surprise and doubt. In the white fog, she seemed to be able to see figures flashing in it, but she couldn't hear any sound coming from it. Moreover, the white fog was constantly changing around her, sometimes condensing into a pattern of mountains and rivers, and sometimes changing into a magnificent scene of the sea and the sky. It was really amazing. She looked at Li Yundong, who was silently pinching his fingers, and suddenly asked boldly, "Master, didn't you tell Su Chan and Zi Yuan that you were here?" Li Yundong didn't even turn his head. While concentrating on mobilizing his Xinqi, he said slowly, "It's useless. This illusion can separate the real world and the virtual world. People outside can't hear the people inside, and the people inside can't hear the people outside." Chris was surprised. From time to time, she looked at the changing white fog in front of her, and then at Li Yundong's hands. She saw that at this time, Li Yundong's hands were quickly pinching the Mahamudra. Every time he pinched a handprint, he would pat in front of him, and suddenly a golden handprint appeared. This handprint seemed to be real and floated in the air. After a long time, it slowly turned into a ray of golden light and scattered around. The speed at which Li Yundong was pinching the Mahamudra with both hands was far faster than the speed at which the Mahamudra dissipated, so in a short time, there were all kinds of Mahamudra in front of Li Yundong. Although Chris didn't recognize these handprints, she saw that there seemed to be a golden wall of Mahamudra in front of Li Yundong. It was like a Buddha wall in the world, majestic and awe-inspiring, which made people feel awe at first glance. The Buddha wall shone with golden light and shone on Li Yundong, making him look like he was covered with a layer of golden sand. He was like the fighting Vajra in Buddhist legends, the supreme Arhat. Chris was in awe. If she hadn't been shocked by the scene in front of her and couldn't move, she would have knelt down and worshipped such a vision. After Li Yundong finished the last Mahamudra, he suddenly exhaled and shouted. Immediately, the Mahamudra wall in front of him shattered into countless golden lights and spread in all directions. Some of the golden lights surrounded the white fog, while others kept penetrating and spreading inside. During the Jin dynasty, Wang Ji went into the mountains to chop firewood and accidentally saw 2 old men playing chess. He watched the game curiously from the side. After watching the game, the handle of the axe he carried with him had already rotted away. There was no sun or moon in the mountains, and no year was known in the heat and cold. In the eyes of the mortal world, this must be some sort of celestial magic from the heavens. One day in the heavens was equivalent to 100 years on earth. In reality, however, in the world of cultivation, this was actually a large-scale illusory spell formation. The prison in the painting ground used by Su Chan was such a powerful illusory magic formation. However, any magic was different because of the caster. Wang Ji had encountered a figure at the level of Almighty Immortal. His body and soul were shrouded in the illusory magic formation, and he was dominated and affected by the power of magic. His whole body's senses were affected by magic, so his body did not decay and his soul did not disperse after hundreds of years. The monk guarding the mountain of Jinyan Tantrism had once confused Zhou Qin with illusory magic, making her almost unable to extricate herself. Abe Yoli of the Yin-Yang Dao had also used illusory magic on Lu Chunping, controlling his body and divine senses, almost turning him into a demon. Top masters like Li Yundong and Zi Yuan had also been trapped in the illusory magic formation of prison in the painting ground by Lu Yi. They thought that they had broken through the surroundings, but in fact, they had not moved at all. Even masters like them had been tricked, which showed how powerful the illusory magic formation was. However, illusory magic was, after all, an illusory magic. In the eyes of the righteous sects such as Jingyi school, it was an inferior magic. Therefore, only a small number of cultivation sects in the world would practice such magic. Among these sects, the Fox Zen school was a grandmaster sect that used illusory magic. In the past, no sect dared to say that they could surpass the Fox Zen school in terms of illusory magic and bewildering magic. However, after thousands of years of inheritance, the Fox Zen school had declined. In Lu Ye's generation, except for him, the others were all half-baked. Only Ao Wushuang could be regarded as proficient in illusory magic. Although she had taught this illusory magic to Su Chan was a playful person and was not willing to work hard to learn it. In addition, her cultivation was low, so Ao Wushuang did not force her to learn the powerful prison in the painting ground. She just made her memorize the incantation, finger incantation, and heart incantation. Naturally, it was impossible for Su Chan to trap the opponent in the magic formation like Lu Yi and escape. It was even more impossible for her to cover the opponent's body with her spiritual energy for hundreds of years like the Jinxian master Wang Ji had met. Although the caster was almost invincible in the illusory magic formation and could trap the opponent with continuous illusions, or directly cause the opponent to collapse or even die with illusory magic, it was already very difficult for her to trap a master at the Jinshan level for 48 hours. Su Chan had only learned this magic for a few days. It was a compliment to say that she was half-baked. At this time, she had used this magic with all her might. The best result was that she and Zi Yuan would be trapped in it together. Everyone would enter the formation together, and no one would be able to come out. Therefore, they and Su Lingxiu were trapped in it, and no one knew that Li Yunyang had come out of the formation. Li Yunyang knew that Su Chan was supporting the magic formation with her own spiritual energy. Once her spiritual energy was exhausted, the magic formation would automatically become invalid. If she wanted to hold on, she would overdraw her essence, qi, and blood. In other words, she would overdraw her yuan-qi in life. This kind of situation was naturally not what Li Yunyang wanted. Moreover, based on his understanding of Su Chan, the little girl didn't know if he could arrive in time, so she would definitely continue to waste time until she died. Therefore, Li Yunyang had already made two preparations. Once the other party broke out of the formation, he would give a fierce blow to Su Lingxiu and Su Lingxiu, who were unaware of it. At the same time, he was prepared to break the formation by force, in case Su Chan's bitter struggle caused irreversible damage to himself. After Li Yunyang shattered the golden Buddha wall in front of him with one palm, he slowly pinched a Vairocana Dharma boundary seal. His whole body slowly floated up, rising higher and higher. He looked down at all living beings from above. At this time, Chris was wrapped in Li Yunyang's spiritual energy, and her Yin spirit was also slowly flying up, still landing about 3 meters behind him. Chris saw that Su Chan had always pinched her fingers when she was casting spells, and Li Yunyang had mostly pinched his fingers when he was fighting. She was so curious that she couldn't help asking, "Master, why do you all pinch your fingers? Can it provide a mysterious power?" Li Yundong didn't even turn his head. He lowered his head and stared at his feet, saying, "The Fox Zen school was founded by the Rock Fox, who studied under Zen Master Baizhang in the middle of the Tang dynasty. At that time, Zen Master Baizhang was influenced by the three secrets in one, so the Rock Fox naturally learned from him and passed it down from generation to generation." Chris listened attentively and suddenly asked, "What is the three secrets in one? Then why do you pinch it too?" Li Yundong said, "Although Zen Master Baizhang practiced the Mahayana sect, which is the Buddhism of the Central Plains, the Tang secret was prevalent at that time, and the three secrets in one advocated by the Tang secret was accepted by the Mahayana sect and the Taoist cultivation sects at the same time. The so-called three secrets in one are the heart secret, the mouth secret, and the finger secret. The heart secret refers to the power generated by visualizing gods and Buddhas in your heart. The mouth secret refers to the power generated by chanting secret mantras in your mouth, and the finger secret refers to the power generated by pinching the Mahamudra with your fingers. When these three forces are combined, they can produce great power." At that time, many cultivators of the Mahayana sect and Taoism very much agreed with the concept of the three secrets in one, so they applied it to magic. You can see that almost every time we Chinese cultivators use magic, we will pinch our fingers, chant the mantras, and visualize gods in our hearts. Chris seemed to have understood something. She was about to ask again when she suddenly heard a loud bang coming from below. A few beams of golden light pierced through the white mist and pointed straight to the sky. Then, an extremely arrogant voice came from the white mist. "Ha ha ha, what kind of shitty maze is this? You're just trying to show off in front of an expert. You were still broken by me." As he spoke, the white mist gradually dissipated, revealing the figures of Su Lingxiu, Su Chan, and Zi Yuan. Su Chan's face was pale and her breathing was rapid. If it weren't for Zi Yuan's support, she would have fallen to the ground. Obviously, this magic formation had consumed all her spiritual energy and jinqi. Zi Yuan stared at Su Ling nervously. She slowly took a breath, but the jinqi in her body was surging quietly. At this time, she didn't know that Li Yunyang had arrived. All her attention was on Su Ling, and she would fight him to the death in a moment. Su Ling's cultivation was far above Su Chan's. He could only be trapped by her for a while, but he would definitely not be trapped by her forever. Su Chan had trapped Su Ling with her weak strength, just like a child locking an adult. Although she had pinched his vital points at the beginning, the difference in strength between the two was too great. After a stalemate, the adult would eventually be able to break free with his own strength. At this time, Su Ling had broken the illusion magic formation, thought that the other party had no more tricks. He said proudly, "Well, what other tricks do you have? Just use them. I'll take them all." But he looked over and saw that although Su Chan's spiritual energy had been overdrawn, her pale face had become even whiter. At this time, she was leaning against Zi Yuan like a weak willow in the wind, delicate and pitiful. It was really pitiful. Although Zi Yuan was in danger, she did not panic at all. She had the appearance of a fairy and the bearing of an immortal. Although Su Ling was not lecherous, when he saw the two beautiful women standing side by side at this time, his heart skipped a beat. He said proudly and arrogantly, "If you two are willing to kneel down and kowtow to me twice, I will spare your lives. In the future, you will follow me and serve me well. Maybe I will teach you good kung fu. What do you think?" When Zi Yuan and Su Chan heard this, they were both furious. Just as they were about to curse, they suddenly heard a cold snort in the air. This cold snort was extremely ordinary in the ears of others, but in the ears of Su Chan and Zi Yuan, it was like a clap of thunder. The two of them felt that this voice was extremely familiar. It was clearly Li Yundong's voice. They looked up in ecstasy and saw Li Yunyang looking down at them from a height of more than 10 meters above their heads. Ziyuan and Su Chan immediately felt relieved. They knew that since Li Yunyang had arrived, they would be free of worry and no longer be in danger. At this time, when Su Ling suddenly heard this voice, he was shocked. With his cultivation quotient, he hadn't noticed that there was a person above his head at all. This was simply incredible. He looked up and saw Li Yunyang at a glance. He suddenly became angry. He raised his head, pointed at him, and shouted, "It's you again, you little bastard. Well, last time I let you take advantage of me in the Battle of Tiandu Peak, this time I must." Before he could finish his words, Li Yunyang had already slapped down angrily. How dare he say this to Su Chan and Ziyuan? You're courting death. Li Yunyang attacked angrily. He had been prepared for this. At this time, he struck out with his palm. Suddenly, the golden light hidden around him condensed in an instant and gathered crazily in front of Li Yunyang, forming a golden Mahamudra Buddha wall. Then, one Mahamudra after another, bombarded Su Ling like a storm. Chris, who was behind Li Yunyang, only felt that this wall-like Mahamudra was falling down like a rocket launcher. In an instant, Su Ling and Su Kong were all shrouded in it. With a rumbling sound, Li Yunyang's hundreds of Mahamudra, with the power of 3 secrets in one, rushed out like a flood. The position where Su Ling and Su Kong were standing seemed to have been bombarded by a cannon. In an instant, their figures were swallowed up and disappeared. Chapter 768. When Li Yundong had fought with Su Ling, he had still been at the top level of the Yang spirit. At this time, he had already cultivated to the top level of the Jinshan. Although there was only one level difference between their realms, their strength was incomparable. Su Ling had thought that Li Yundong was still the ignorant man from Tiandu Peak. Caught off guard, he naturally suffered a great loss. His current strength was weaker than Li Yundong's, and he had been careless and miscalculated. How could he not suffer a great loss? When he suddenly saw the Mahamudra smashing toward him like a storm, his heart suddenly trembled, and a trace of despair flashed in his eyes. Li Yundong's Mahamudra Kung Fu was extremely powerful. Often, a Mahamudra had the power to shake heaven and earth. At this time, hundreds of them had gathered and slapped down one after another. The power could be imagined. At this moment, Su Ling's mind went blank, and he thought to himself, "My life is over." But at this time, the blind man beside him roared. He suddenly rose up and jumped toward Li Yundong's Mahamudra. Su Kong knew that he was disabled. At this time, Li Yundong had struck out so many Mahamudra with thunderous momentum. His Shixiang might be able to escape, but he would definitely die. Once he was hit by a palm, although he would not die immediately, it would be impossible for him to escape the other Mahamudra that followed like a storm. And with the friendship between him and his Shixiang, he knew that his Shixiang would definitely not let him be killed by the Mahamudra. He would definitely do his best to save him. At that time, he would become a burden to his Shixiang. Therefore, Su Kong knew that he would definitely die, so he immediately used the most ferocious and terrifying move of Zenkingism, 10,000 Paths Destruction. Although cultivators cherished their bodies and lives, it was inevitable that they would encounter powerful opponents who made them desperate. Once their yang spirit was captured by their opponents, or their bodies were occupied and refined by them, it would be a fate worse than death. Therefore, some fierce cultivators created their own moves to perish together with strong enemies. This kind of move was different in each sect, but the principle was mostly the same, and it was very simple. Cultivators could control their pores at will. Once they closed all their pores, they would become a completely leakless cauldron, just like a pressure cooker without air holes. At this time, they were frantically circulating their essence qi and blood, constantly producing true essence. This caused the qi in the pressure cooker to become more and more intense, until the cauldron could no longer withstand it and finally exploded. This principle was similar to the explosion of a gas tank, a pressure cooker, and a grenade. Cultivators could use themselves as a medium to generate a huge explosive force. They could instantly release several times their own strength in order to perish together with the enemy. Just from the name, one could tell how ferocious Su Ling's move was. If he used this move with the power of Jinshan or Thunder Retribution, it would really form a terrible scene of 10,000 paths destruction. Su Ling jumped into the air, and his body grew larger and larger as he flew, like a balloon that was constantly expanding. When he touched Li Yundong's Mahamudra, his body exploded in an instant and turned into a cloud of blood mist in an instant. Boom! There was a loud noise. This burst of explosion immediately stopped Li Yunyang's Mahamudra. The Mahamudra, which had been moving like thunder, obviously paused for a moment when it was about to hit Su Ling. However, in less than a second, Su Ling had completely reacted. Although his cultivation was not as good as Li Yundong's, at this time, he saw that in order to save him, his shidi had actually used a skill to perish together with him. Unfortunately, his cultivation quotient was too far away from Li Yundong's, so he could only block the Mahamudra a little. He couldn't even shake it away, but could only block its momentum a little. Su Ling watched his shidi die tragically in front of him. In an instant, his pupils shrank to the size of needles, and he let out a beast-like roar. Su Ling knew that his shidi was completely dead. His body and soul had been destroyed. He was so angry that he wanted to tear Li Yundong into pieces, but he knew that even if he wanted to take revenge, he had to survive first. If he wanted to survive, he had to survive this storm-like bombardment. Su Ling gritted his teeth, and the power of Jinshan suddenly came out, forming a golden barrier in front of his head, and forcibly withstood the overwhelming golden Mahamudra. At this time, both Chris, who was next to Li Yundong, and Su Chan and Zi Yuan, who were more than 10 meters away from Su Ling, saw the golden Mahamudra sweep over in an instant like a stormy sea and swallow Su Ling whole. At first, the rumbling sound of the golden Mahamudra hitting Su Ling's body was a little scattered, like a person swinging a hammer repeatedly with both hands. But soon, the sound became one, rising and falling. Gradually, the sound became more and more dense, deafening and creepy. Su Chan and Zi Yuan knew that with Li Yundong's exquisite control, he would definitely not let the Mahamudra affect them, but just hearing the dense sound made their hair stand on end and their hearts tremble. Chris subconsciously covered her ears with her hands, as if the sound would shatter her non-existent eardrums. If she hadn't been by Li Yundong's side at this time and protected by his Yuanyang Qi, she was afraid that the shock wave caused by the Mahamudra would have shattered her Yin spirit. The three of them didn't know how long it had been, but when Li Yundong's Mahamudra finally stopped bombarding, the world returned to peace. Chris looked down from above and saw that Su Ling had disappeared. There was only a deep pit about 3 meters in diameter, as if Su Ling had been blown into powder. As soon as Chris let out a cheer, she saw a figure suddenly fly out of the deep pit like a cannonball and rush toward Li Yundong like a bolt of lightning. Li Yunyang's heart skipped a beat. He immediately understood that after Su Ling had resisted a few Mahamudra, he must have transferred the force to the ground, causing him to be slammed into the ground like a nail. Although this seemed to be a great loss of face, it had saved Su Ling's life. Otherwise, if he had stood upright and taken it head-on, he would have definitely been blown into powder. Li Yundong saw Su Ling pouncing on him like a mad tiger, and his momentum was like a rainbow, as if he wanted to die with him. He smiled coldly and slapped down, meeting Su Ling's palm head-on. With a loud bang, this head-on collision immediately sent Su Ling flying back and smashing into the ground like a meteorite, causing countless dust to splash up. When the smoke and dust dissipated, Su Ling staggered up from the ground. His hair was disheveled and his face was covered in blood. He gritted his teeth and said, "Little bastard, I'm going to kill you. I must kill you. Give me back my shidi's life." Fighting was one of the cruelest and most dangerous things in the world. Once you met a deadly enemy and lost, you would be doomed eternally. Su Ling roared like a wild beast in grief and anger. His eyes became redder and redder, and the golden light all over his body became brighter and brighter. His body slowly grew larger and larger. Li Yundong suddenly noticed that Su Ling's Zhenqi was growing at an astonishing rate. His heart suddenly trembled. He lowered his head and shouted at Zi Yuan and Su Chan, "Come to me quickly." Without thinking, Zi Yuan immediately pulled Su Chan and flew to Li Yundong's side. Li Yundong pinched his fingers together, activated his Xinqi, and quickly shot out the immovable fundamental seal and the Amitabha fundamental seal. These golden Mahamudra were slapped in the air by Li Yundong, like relief sculptures, condensed and not scattered. They quickly formed a huge golden ball, tightly wrapping Li Yundong, Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Chris. Su Ling's move of 10,000 paths and people vanish couldn't cause any damage to Li Yundong at all. However, when Su Ling used the power of Jinshin to make this move, its power was incomparable. Even if it was the primary level of Jinshin, once its power was increased several times, what would it be like? Li Yundong didn't dare to be careless, especially with Su Chan and Zi Yuan by his side. He would rather be injured than see them hurt, so he used all his strength at this time. At this time, looking from a distance, Li Yundong and the others could no longer be seen. Only a huge golden ball was floating in the air, like a golden moon. At this time, Su Ling's body swelled up, and his whole body was like a huge balloon. He laughed wildly and roared, "Little bastard, I must kill you. Just wait and see." Li Yundong heard his clamor and was very vigilant at first, but the more he listened, the more he felt that something was wrong. At this time, Zi Yuan suddenly said, "Oh no, he's going to escape." As soon as Zi Yuan's voice fell, Su Ling's body exploded with a bang. It was as if a giant bomb had exploded under the ground, and countless dazzling golden lights quickly fled in all directions. At this time, Li Yundong had set up a heavy defense to block Su Ling's move of 10,000 paths and people vanish, but he had never expected that Su Ling had just used an incomplete version of 10,000 paths and people vanish at the cost of his own body cauldron, making Li Yundong mistakenly think that he was going to die with him. However, he had taken advantage of the power of the explosion of his body cauldron to quickly escape with his yang spirit. Li Yundong wanted to chase after him, but at this time, he was trapped in the golden light handprint formation he had set up. It was too late for him to catch up. Even if he wanted to take out the burning thumb pot again, it was too late. Damn it, I still let him escape. Li Yundong gritted his teeth and cursed, but deep in his heart, he was also shocked by Su Ling's decisive courage. He thought to himself, this guy will definitely be a big scourge in the future. If I meet him again next time, I must not let him escape again. Otherwise, there will be endless troubles in the future. Li Yundong's eyes flickered, and he slowly descended from the air with Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Chris. He nodded to Su Chan and Zi Yuan with a smile and said, "Are you two all right?" Su Chan wrapped her arms around Li Yundong's waist and greedily sniffed his strong masculine scent. She closed her eyes tiredly and murmured, "I'm fine. I'm so tired. Yundong, let me sleep for a while." Li Yundong stroked her head lovingly, then turned to Zi Yuan and nodded. "Let's go somewhere else to talk." Zi Yuan nodded, and the four of them quickly rose into the air and flew in the direction of Chris's house. At this time, because of the explosion caused by Su Ling's self-destruction, the ground, which had been stained black by the 5 ghosts and 5 plagues, magic, seemed to have been plowed. The soil underneath was turned over again, and the ground was a mess. After an unknown period of time, a roaring police car drove over on the asphalt road not far from this land. A police officer got out of the car. He looked around, held a walkie-talkie in one hand, and said, "Call the front desk. I have arrived at the location mentioned by the reporter." Over. After a while, a voice came from the walkie-talkie. "The front desk has received the report. Did you see a round object of light in the air at the scene?" It turned out that when Li Yundong had been fighting with Su Ling, Su Kong, and the others, the noise had been too big. Although this place was sparsely populated and there were few residents nearby, it did not mean that there were no residents. Especially at the last moment, Li Yundong had protected himself with the flawless circular golden light palm print formation. His whole body was like a huge golden ball, shining with dazzling light. The explosion of the battle between Li Yundong and Su Ling might not have been able to spread more than 10 miles away, but the light of this huge golden ball of light could. The American police system was extremely fast, and they liked to call the police at the slightest sign of trouble. Therefore, as soon as they received the news, the police immediately drove to the scene. The police officer looked around with a flashlight in his other hand, coughed dryly into the walkie-talkie, and said, "Front desk, my place is as messy as a pile of dog shit. There's a deep pit on the ground. I think there's been a war here. Over." Soon, the front desk replied, "Damn it, don't care about that damn pit and dog shit." Someone called the police and said that they saw a golden round UFO there. "Answer me, what the hell is that?" Over. The police officer looked up at the sky carefully. After a while, he said seriously, "Call the front desk. I did see a golden round thing." Over. The front desk was also quite surprised. "Damn it, there really is one? What is that? Is it UFO?" Over. The police officer looked up at the full moon in the sky and said in a strange tone, "That's a moon." Over. Chapter 769. Li Yundong had forced Su Ke to self-destruct with the force of a thunderbolt, and Su Ling had destroyed his own body. The Jinshin Yang spirit had turned into countless clones and fled in all directions. He couldn't catch up with them, so he could only take Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Chris back to Chris' home first. When they were about to reach Chris' house, Zi Yuan suddenly remembered something and said to Li Yundong, "By the way, Li Yundong, my powerful magical weapon is still in Han Zhen's house by Yu Huang Xiandu. Now I can't feel the aura of this powerful magical weapon. I think Su Ling didn't have time to take Yu Huang Xiandu with him when he escaped." Li Yundong was carrying the unconscious Su Chan on his back. He thought to himself, "I've seen the power of this powerful magical weapon. In a one-on-one fight, the power of this powerful magical weapon is too heaven-defying. It doesn't have any attack power, but it can be used to exchange for any powerful magical weapon of the opponent. If used properly, it can completely change the situation and change the situation of the battle. It can be said that with this powerful magical weapon, there are no cultivators in the world who can use powerful magical weapons to suppress me." Li Yundong nodded slightly and said, "Then we can't let this powerful magical weapon fall into the hands of others. I just don't know where the powerful magical weapon of the 5 ghosts and 5 plagues has gone. Has it been taken away by Su Ling?" Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, "I didn't see Su Ling use the 5 ghosts and 5 plagues magic treasure when I broke out of the prison in the painting illusory maze. He must have put it away in the magic formation. Maybe he took it with him, or maybe it was smashed into powder by your golden light handprint formation." Li Yundong himself was at the top of the Jinshin phase. More than 100 Mahamudra had smashed down before, and even steel had been smashed into slag, let alone a jade powerful magical weapon. Li Yundong sighed softly and said, "I hope that such a vicious powerful magical weapon will no longer be left in the world to harm people." The two of them whispered and, under the guidance of Chris, once again came to Han Zhen's house. Although the two powerful enemies, Su Ling and Su, had been defeated, Zi Yuan and Chris were really worried about whether there was anyone else behind Han Zhen. The two of them hesitated at the door, but Li Yundong, who was skilled and bold, went straight in. As soon as he entered the door, he saw that there was no one upstairs and downstairs, and the surroundings seemed a little messy. Zi Yuan looked around and found that Han Zhen had obviously come back before. He had taken some things and fled in a hurry. He couldn't take the two powerful magical weapons in the living room with him, so he had to let them stay. At this time, the Yu Huang Xiandu was floating in the air. Although the 9-ling Xiandu was purple, but there was a 5-colored light flowing on the edge of the powerful magical weapon. Although it was of the color, of the ling, of the Xian Yundong, of the ling of Tian of fairy, and Yundong. The Yu Huang immortal capital, on the other hand, stood motionless in the same place, like an ancient minister holding a jade tablet and standing quietly in the court. At this time, Zi Yuan also knew that the Yu Huang Xiandu had fallen into Li Yundong's hands. She no longer had to worry about a powerful magical weapon in the world that could completely restrain her. Her heart gradually relaxed and she smiled. This powerful magical weapon is said to be a powerful magical weapon refined by Zhang Jihe, and this Jinren Zuanzenzi can write an idyllic poem like The Fisherman's Song. He must be very open-minded and understanding. I didn't expect that he would refine such an overbearing and rigid powerful magical weapon. After Li Yunyang gently put Su Chan on the sand, he stretched out his hand and generously grabbed Yu Huang Xiandu, saying, "In front of Mount Shisai, egrets fly, peach blossoms flow, mandarin fish are fat. Green bamboo hat, green straw raincoat, no need to return in the slanting wind and fine rain." Standing on the land of the United States, Li Yundong had just beaten Su Ling and Su Kong. At this time, he had taken over the Yu Huang Xiandu, reciting Zhang Jihe's The Fisherman's Song, while activating his Jinqi to subdue Yu Huang Xiandu. The scene was really weird. However, Zi Yuan and Chris were used to it and didn't feel anything wrong at all. They just stared at the Yu Huang Xiandu in Li Yundong's hand with their eyes wide open. The two of them saw that the Yu Huang Xiandu was still struggling crazily at first, trembling in Li Yundong's hand. However, as Li Yundong's Jinqi poured in like an avalanche, the Yu Huang Xiandu was soon completely subdued by Li Yundong. The Jinqi left by Su Ling in the past was wiped out by Li Yundong. Chris didn't understand the mystery and difficulty of it. She was just a layman watching the fun. She had originally thought that there would be a strange scene, and she was worried that there would be a fierce battle between cultivators and powerful magical weapons in this community. However, she hadn't expected that the Yu Huang Xiandu would just tremble twice and then stop moving. She breathed a sigh of relief, but she also felt a little disappointed. However, Zi Yuan knew that Li Yundong had calmly recited the famous poem that the owner of this powerful magical weapon had spread throughout the world, and at the same time, he had subdued this powerful magical weapon with his powerful Jinqi. In such a short time, he had subdued a Jinshan-level powerful magical weapon. Even if this kind of leisurely walking skill was not unparalleled in the world, it was definitely rare in the world. After Li Yundong subdued the Yu Huang Xiandu, he played with the powerful magical weapon in his hand. He smiled slightly, raised his hand, and said to Zi Yuan, "Take it." At this time, Zi Yuan waved her hand and called the ninth heaven Zi Yuan silk to her. The long, silk-like powerful magical weapon drilled into her sleeve like a spirit snake. When Zi Yuan saw that Li Yundong had thrown the Yu Huang Xiandu to her, she was surprised. She reached out to take it and asked curiously, "Why did you give it to me?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "Keep it for self-defense. Your ninth heaven Zi Yuan silk is a very powerful magical weapon. Even if you encounter a powerful magical weapon like the Xianyuan sword, it's not like you don't have the power to fight back. But this Yu Huang Xiandu is the absolute nemesis of your powerful magical weapon. It's best for you to keep it, in case someone uses it to kill you one day." However, Zi Yuan smiled and said, "It's in your hands. I don't need to worry. You have more enemies than me, so you should take it." Seeing that Zi Yuan was about to throw the Yu Huang Xiandu over, Li Yundong smiled and said, "Okay, just take it. Don't push it around." As he said this, Li Yundong glanced at Zi Yuan, and his gaze suddenly became a little strange, as if he was saying, "Maybe one day, if I have a conflict with Wang Yuanshan and you have to help your master, won't you hate me if I use this powerful magical weapon to kill you?" Li Yundong's thoughts were like flying immortals from beyond the sky. They were extremely jumpy, but the thoughts revealed in his eyes were seen by Zi Yuan. She actually understood 70 to 80% of them. She also cast a glance at Li Yundong, as if to say, "I will never be your enemy in this life. Even if you use this powerful magical weapon to suppress me, I will be willing and never fight back." If one were to say who Li Yundong loved the most among the women around him, it would undoubtedly be Su Chan, who had gone through thick and thin with him. But if one were to say who understood him the best, it would undoubtedly be Zi Yuan. The two of them exchanged glances, and the two of them suddenly had a sense of tacit understanding. They looked at each other and smiled slightly. At the same time, they had the thought of, my parents gave birth to me, and Yundong knows me. Li Yundong smiled slightly and said softly to Yuan, you should take it. This is what you deserve. If it weren't for you, I'm afraid that Su Chan and Chris would have been in danger this time. Then it would be too late for me to regret it. However, Yuan smiled and said, speaking of which, Su Chan saved my life. If it weren't for her prison painting, I'm afraid I wouldn't have been able to escape this disaster. In my opinion, we might as well give this powerful magical weapon to Su Chan to use. She doesn't have any powerful magical weapons with her. Keeping this powerful magical weapon can be used for self-defense. Li Yundong thought for a moment, but still shook his head and said, no, she likes to be lazy. If she has this powerful magical weapon, she will have even more reason to be lazy. Don't spoil her. It's better for you to take it. Chris, who was standing to one side, saw the two of them pushing and treating each other with respect. This kind of behavior was really a little strange in the eyes of Westerners. She wanted to shout, since you don't want it, then give it to me. However, if such words were spoken by a boorish man like Hardadef, he would have most likely blurted it out. However, Chris was a well-mannered lady from a respectable family. Although she thought so, she interrupted their concession and said, I say. Can you guys discuss this, the ownership of the magic treasure later? Can I ask, where is Han Zhen now? Also, has my soul detachment been lifted? At this time, Li Yundong no longer pushed Yuan. He nodded to her. Although his smile was gentle, his eyes were very firm, asking her to accept it. Yuan couldn't refuse, so she had no choice but to accept it. In her heart, she had made up her mind to find an opportunity to hand it over to Su Chan. Seeing that she had accepted it, Li Yundong looked around and said to Chris, if I were Han Zhen, no matter who won or lost, I would definitely escape to a safe place to hide first and ask others to help me keep an eye on the situation outside. After the outcome of the battle is determined, I will show up. Li Yundong pointed to the messy scene around him and said, Han Zhen is obviously not a fool. He must be hiding here foolishly waiting for the result. Chris bit her lip and said hatefully, this bastard, how dare he attack my grandma? I will never let him off. As she said this, she said anxiously to Li Yundong, that bad Taoist is dead. Should my soul detachment be lifted? Li Yundong's gaze became a little strange. It has been lifted. Chris immediately felt relieved and patted her chest. That's good. As long as Grandma is fine. She said hesitantly, but the soul detachment lost its effect because the caster forcibly left, so the last part of your grandma's soul also dissipated. This sentence shocked Chris as if she had been struck by lightning. She trembled all over and her eyes suddenly widened. What? You mean, my grandmother, she? Chris covered her mouth, and her big blue eyes were full of tears. In an instant, her eyes became hazy. She knelt down in front of Li Yundong and sobbed, Master, please save my grandma. As long as you save her, I will do anything you ask me to do. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.